The thin man on the livery horse pulled a nickel-plated pistol from inside his coat. He did not aim it at the man with the cane on the porch. He did not aim it at the three brothers with rifles in the snow. He aimed it at the woman in the doorway, the woman in the navy blue dress, the woman who had come 1,100 miles from Boston with one carpet bag and one cameo brooch and a folded letter in her pocket that had promised her a home. He cocked the hammer, and she did not flinch. Tonight, my friends, you are about to hear the story of how that woman ended up on that porch with a Boston banker's pistol pointed at her heart and 3 Montana mountain men ready to die for her. The story of a woman who once knelt in the mud of Iron Ridge and whispered 8 words that would change the course of 4 lives. I am Marcus, and this is Frontier Rescue Stories. Hit that subscribe button if you love tales of the Old West of hard men and harder winters of love that was earned and not given. Drop a comment and tell me where you are listening from tonight. Now pour yourself a cup of coffee, settle into your chair, and let me carry you back to the winter of 1878. The wind that came down off the Bitter Creek peaks that November afternoon did not care about anyone. It did not care that a woman had traveled 1,100 miles to find a husband who never came to meet her. It did not care that her boots were soaked through. It did not care that her pride had cost her every coin she owned. The wind cut across the muddy main street of Iron Ridge like a knife through cheap cloth, and the woman it cut into was kneeling in a puddle of brown sludge outside the Golden Nugget Saloon, her honey blonde hair fallen loose from its pins, her navy blue traveling dress soaked black at the hem. 3 men on horseback had stopped 20 paces away. She did not see them yet. She was looking at her own hands, palms pressed flat in the mud, and she was trying to remember how to stand up. Her knees would not work. Her breath was coming in short white puffs. The first snow of winter had started while she was inside the saloon asking for directions, and now it was falling on her shoulders in a soft veil that would have been beautiful if she had been anywhere else, with anyone else on her way to anything other than what waited for her now. The bartender had thrown her out. He had thrown her into the street like a sack of rotten potatoes, and the men inside had laughed. Her name was Adelaide Marsden. She was 23 years old. She had come from Boston with one carpet bag, one cameo brooch at her throat, and a folded letter in her pocket that had promised her a home. The letter had lied. A man stepped down from the lead horse. She heard the boots hit the mud. She did not look up. She could not. The shame was so heavy on her neck that it felt like a wet rope. Then she heard a voice low and rough as river stone. "Easy now, ma am." A coat fell across her shoulders. It smelled of wood smoke and pine and tanned leather, and it was so heavy it nearly pushed her flat. Hands the size of dinner plates lifted her at the elbows, and she was on her feet again, swaying, looking up. 3 men, 3 faces that were the same face. Tonight, my friends, you are about to hear the story of a woman who believed she was worth nothing, and 3 brothers on a Montana mountain who would spend the rest of their lives proving her wrong. A woman who knelt in the mud of Iron Ridge and whispered 8 words that would change the course of 4 lives. I am Marcus, and this is Frontier Rescue Stories. Before we go any further, do me one small kindness. If you love tales of the Old West of hard men and harder winters of love that was earned and not given, hit that subscribe button. drop a comment, and tell me where you are listening from tonight. I read every one. Now pour yourself a cup of coffee, settle into your chair, and let me carry you back to the winter of 1878. Adelaide Marsden was born in Boston in the spring of 1855, in a narrow brick house above a bakery on the corner of Beacon and Charles. Her father was a man named Henry Marsden, a baker out of Liverpool, who had crossed the Atlantic at 20 with nothing but a sack of starter dough wrapped in cheesecloth and a stubborn faith that good bread could feed a man for life. Her mother Eleanor had come from a respectable family in Salem and had married down, as her people put it, when she chose Henry over a banker with soft hands. The Marsden Bakery on Beacon Street became known across that part of the city for its sourdough, its butter croissants, and its honey wheat. And on Sunday mornings, the line ran out the door and around the corner to Pinckney. Adelaide grew up with flour in her hair and the smell of yeast in her dresses. By the time she was 12, she could shape a perfect boule with her eyes closed. By the time she was 15, her mother had taught her to read Shakespeare aloud while she kneaded the morning dough, because Eleanor believed a woman with a gift for words could not be put down by any man. Adelaide had a fine, soft alto voice, and she sang in the church choir on Sunday evenings, and she wore silk ribbons in her hair when she walked to the market with her mother, and she believed, as girls of 17 sometimes do, that the world she stood in was the world she would always stand in. She was wrong. In the winter of 1874, the typhoid fever came through Beacon Hill like a black tide. 2 of the children in the parish school died first, then the old butcher on Charles Street, then Eleanor Marsden, who had nursed 3 sick neighbors and refused to wear a kerchief over her mouth because she said God did not strike down kindness. She died on a Tuesday morning in February with her hand in her daughter's hand, and she did not say goodbye because by the end she could not speak. Henry Marsden buried his wife on Friday. He took to his bed on Saturday. He was dead by the following Wednesday. Adelaide was 19 years old. She had no brothers and no sisters and no living grandparents, and the snow on her parents' graves had not melted before the man with the soft hands came knocking. His name was Cornelius Pemberton. He was 45 then, a senior officer at the Boston Mercantile Trust, a tall, thin man with a face like a ferret and a voice like warm oil. He carried a leather portfolio under his arm and a black umbrella in his hand, and he stood in the parlor of the Marsden Bakery, and he told Adelaide with great gentleness that her father had taken a small loan against the property in 1869, and that the loan was now in arrears, and that, as a friend of the family, as a Christian man, he wanted nothing more than to help her keep the place. He brought a contract. The interest was reasonable, he said. 6%. She signed. 6 months later, the interest was 11%. He was very sorry. The bank board had insisted. 6 months after that, the interest was 17, and a clause she had not read carefully gave the bank the right to assume the property if any payment was missed by more than 30 days. She missed a payment by 31 days. The bakery was sold at auction in the autumn of 1876. The brick house above it was sold the following spring. Pemberton bought both at a fraction of their value through a shell company called Beacon Holdings Limited, which Adelaide would not learn the truth of until much later. By the summer of 1877, she was a parlor maid in the home of a railroad man on Commonwealth Avenue, sleeping in an unheated room above the kitchen, scrubbing other women's silk and mending other women's lace, and Cornelius Pemberton came to call on her one September evening with a basket of pears and a proposal that was not a proposal at all. He told her she still owed the bank $2,200. He told her there was a way to settle the debt that did not involve money. He told her he kept a small townhouse on Charles Street where a discreet woman could live very comfortably, and that he was a generous man who took good care of his arrangements. She slapped him. She did not know she was going to do it until her hand was already moving. He caught her wrist before she could pull it back, and he held it tight enough that she felt the bones grind, and he smiled at her with his thin teeth and said in that same warm, oily voice that she would change her mind by Christmas. She did not change her mind. She ran. She ran in the rain to St. Augustine's Episcopal on Hanover Street, and she pounded on the side door of the rectory until Reverend Obadiah Sutter opened it in his nightshirt with a candle in his hand. Reverend Sutter was 67 years old, a thin gray man with a long, sad face who had buried both her parents and christened her at 6 weeks. He took her into his kitchen. He gave her tea. He listened to her story, and when she was done, he sat for a long time with his hands folded on the oilcloth table. Then he stood and he went to a drawer, and he came back with a folded newspaper. It was a little 4-page weekly out of Chicago called Heart and Hand. He turned it to the back page. He pointed to an advertisement halfway down the second column. She read it once. She read it again. The 4th time she read it, her hands were shaking. Wanted, the advertisement said. A respectable woman of good character to share life in the Montana wilderness. 3 brothers, hard-working ranchers and trappers, honest men with a warm cabin and a willingness to provide. Must be willing to cook, mend, and endure hardship. Reply care of S. Thorne, Bitter Creek, Montana Territory. 3 brothers, she said. 3. Reverend Sutter folded his hands again. Adelaide, he said, I am not a fool, and I will not pretend this is anything but a desperate measure, but there is a country out west where a man's word is still currency, and where Cornelius Pemberton's reach does not extend. If these men are even half as honest as that small paragraph suggests, you will be safer with them than you are tonight in this city. She wrote the letter that same night at his kitchen table in his hand because her own would not stop trembling. She mailed it the next morning. She waited 8 weeks. The reply came in late January of 1878 in a thin envelope with a Helena postmark and 3 short lines written in a small, hard, masculine hand. The lines said only that a ticket would follow, that the journey would take 11 days, and that she would be met at Iron Ridge. The signature read simply, S. Thorne. The ticket arrived 2 weeks later. She kissed Reverend Sutter on the cheek at the South Station platform on a cold morning in early November. She boarded the westbound. She did not look back. She would not see Boston again for 30 years. The train carried her across a country that grew bigger every mile. Through New York and Pennsylvania, through the great gray sweep of Ohio, through the endless flat brown of Illinois and Iowa, across the muddy Missouri at Omaha, and out into the long empty sea of the high plains. She slept in the third-class car with her carpet bag for a pillow and the letter folded inside her bodice against her skin. She ate hard biscuits and drank weak coffee. She watched the prairie roll past her window, and she tried to imagine what a man who lived on a Montana mountain looked like, and she could not. She had nothing in her memory to draw from. The men of Boston wore wool suits and gold watch chains and shaved every morning. The men in the Heart and Hand advertisement might as well have been figures from a dream. On the 11th day, the train pulled into a wooden platform at the foot of a great gray ridge, and a conductor in a stained blue coat called out the name. Iron Ridge. End of the line. All passengers off. She climbed down with her carpet bag in one hand. The platform was empty. The wind was hard and cold and smelled of snow. She stood there for a long time because she did not know what else to do. She stood there for 3 hours. A boy of perhaps 9, thin as a willow whip, finally came past with a bucket of cold ashes and stared at her like she was a ghost. She asked him if anyone had come down from Bitter Creek that day to meet a woman from the east. He shrugged. He said the Thorne brothers had not been seen in town since the 2nd week of October. He said they did not come down in winter. They were mountain men. Everybody knew that. Then he ran off with his bucket and left her alone again. The light was failing when a stout woman in a gray dress came striding across the platform with her arms folded against the cold. Her name was Prudence Hawthorne, and she ran the only respectable boarding house in Iron Ridge, and she had watched Adelaide standing on her platform from her front window for 2 hours, and her conscience had finally won out over her business sense. Prue took one look at Adelaide's blue lips and her thin cloak, and made a sound somewhere between a sigh and a curse, and she picked up the carpet bag and said, "Child, you are coming home with me." Prue's parlor was warm and smelled of beef and onions and burning pine. She fed Adelaide a bowl of stew and a slice of buttered cornbread, and she sat across the oak table with her elbows on it and her gray eyes steady, and she told her the truth. The Thorne brothers were good men, Prue said. Hard men. Quiet men. There were 3 of them identical as 3 pebbles from the same creek. Silas was the oldest by an hour, the steady one, the one who made the decisions and held the family together after their father died 7 winters back of a bad heart. Then Jonas, hot-tempered and quick to laugh, the one who played the harmonica on summer evenings and could shoot a squirrel out of a tree at 80 paces. And Ezekiel the youngest by 20 minutes, who they called Zeke, the gentle one, the one with books on his shelf and a year of college in Helena before he came home to help his brothers when their father passed. But Adelaide Prue said, leaning forward, "Silas Thorne lost his wife 5 years ago, lost her hard. She died on his bed in the middle of a blizzard with a baby that came too early, and that baby died with her. He has not come down off that mountain in winter since. And I am sorry to be the one to tell you, but I do not believe he sent for you." Adelaide stared at the steam rising off her stew. "Then who sent for me?" she said. Prue shook her head. "I do not know. Maybe he did in a moment of weakness and changed his mind. Men do that, especially men who are still mourning. But I will tell you this. You cannot stay in Iron Ridge. There is a man in town this past week, a thin Eastern man with a face like a ferret, asking after a Boston girl who skipped on a debt. He has money. He has been buying drinks for our sheriff." Adelaide's spoon clattered against the bowl. Pemberton, she whispered. Already. Prue's face hardened. Then you have one option, child. You go up that mountain. You walk into the Thorn place uninvited, and you ask Silas Thorn to his face whether he meant the letter or did not. He is a hard man, but he is an honorable one. He will not turn a woman out into the snow, not even if his own pride says he should. Adelaide did not sleep that night. She lay in Prue's narrow guest bed, with the letter pressed to her heart and the wind hammering at the shutters, and she thought about Cornelius Pemberton's thin teeth, and she thought about 3 faceless men on a mountain 3 days' ride to the north, and somewhere before dawn she made her choice. She would not run east. She would not run east ever again. She got up before sunrise. She braided her hair tight. She ate the bread and bacon Prue pressed into her hands, and she walked out into the cold morning with her carpet bag, and she went to the only place in Iron Ridge that might point her toward a road up the ridge. She went to the Golden Nugget Saloon. It was not the kind of place a woman went into in 1878, not unless she was a certain kind of woman, and Adelaide was not. But she had no choice. She pushed open the heavy double doors, and the smell hit her like a slap. Stale beer and old smoke, and the sharp metal stink of unwashed men. The room was half full at 8 in the morning. Heads turned. Conversation died. The bartender was a great fat man in a stained apron with arms like hams and a face like a clenched fist. His name was Bart Kessler. He looked at her over the polished bar, and his small eyes narrowed. "I am looking for the trail to Bitter Creek," she said. "I am told the Thorn brothers live in that direction. I would be very grateful for directions." Bart Kessler stared at her for 3 seconds. Then he came around the bar. She tried to back away. She was not fast enough. He was a big man, but he moved like a big animal, smooth and certain, and he had her by the upper arm before she could turn. He hauled her toward the doors. She did not scream. Some old Boston instinct in her would not let her scream in front of these men. He kicked the door open with his boot, and he threw her bodily into the street. She landed on her hands and knees in 6 inches of cold mud and frozen straw and horse manure, and her carpet bag spilled, and the cameo brooch from her throat broke loose and fell into the muck. "Stay out, woman!" Bart Kessler shouted from the doorway. "We do not feed strays here. Go beg somewhere else." The men inside laughed. She heard them. She would hear that laugh in her dreams for years. The doors banged shut. The first snow of the year began to fall soft and silent, settling on her shoulders and her hair and the back of her neck. She knelt in the mud. She could not feel her fingers. Somewhere in the gray distance, a dog was barking. She thought very clearly and very calmly that she was going to die in this street, and that no one in this town would even pay to bury her. Then she heard the boots in the mud. She heard a low, rough voice say, "Easy now, ma-am." She felt a coat fall across her shoulders, a great heavy coat that smelled of smoke and pine. She felt hands lift her at the elbows. She was on her feet. She was looking up. 3 men. 3 faces that were the same face. All 3 of them above 6 feet tall. All 3 broad through the shoulder and weathered through the cheek. All 3 wearing wolf-skin coats and wide-brimmed hats, and the long scarred hands of men who had spent their lives outdoors. They stood in a half-circle around her like 3 dark pines. The one closest to her, the one whose coat was now on her shoulders, had a long, pale scar down the left cheek that pulled the corner of his mouth into something that might have been a permanent half-smile. His eyes were a gray-blue, the color of a winter creek under cloud. He spoke first. "Easy now, Ma," he said again. "You took a hard fall." The middle one broader through the chest than his brother had, eyes the warm brown of good whiskey, and a softer mouth, and he was already kneeling in the mud, scooping the contents of her carpet bag back inside. He picked up the broken cameo and wiped it on his sleeve and held it out to her without a word. The third man had not moved. He sat his black gelding 10 feet back, both hands folded on the saddle horn, and he looked down at her with eyes the color of amber held to a candle flame. They were the most still eyes she had ever seen. They were not unkind. They were just empty in a way that frightened her more than Pemberton's smile ever had. Snow had gathered on the brim of his hat and on the shoulders of his coat. He had not spoken. He did not look like he intended to. The scarred one cleared his throat. "I am Jonas Thorne, Ma," he said. "That fellow on the ground is my brother Zeke. The one who has not bothered to introduce himself is Silas. Forgive him, he is not much for company." Adelaide opened her mouth. No sound came out. The cold and the shame had taken her voice. Jonas Thorne saw it. His eyes softened. "What is your name, Ma?" he asked. She tried twice. The third time it came out a whisper. "Adelaide," she said. "Adelaide Marsden, from Boston. I came west. I came west to marry a Mr. Silas Thorne of Bitter Creek, Montana Territory." The silence that fell on that muddy street was the deepest silence she had ever stood inside. Jonas's mouth fell open. Zeke straightened up from his crouch, the cameo still in his hand, and turned slowly toward the man on the black horse. Even Bart Kessler, who had been watching through the saloon window, took a step back from the glass. Silas Thorne did not move. He did not speak. His eyes stayed on her face, and a muscle worked once in his jaw, and that was the only sign that he had heard her at all. Then he closed his eyes. He closed them and let his head drop forward against his chest, just for a breath, the way a man does when he is taking the news of a death. When he opened them again, something had changed in them. Not warmth, just a kind of weary old pain coming up out of a deep place. He swung down off the horse. He was the tallest of the three by perhaps an inch. He walked through the mud without seeming to notice it. He stopped 2 feet in front of her, and he looked down at her, and she had to crane her neck to meet his eyes. "There has been a mistake, Miss Marsden," he said. His voice was low and quiet and as worn as old leather. There was no cruelty in it. There was no warmth in it either. It was the voice of a man saying a hard, true thing he had said many times before. "I wrote that advertisement," he said. "I wrote it last spring in a moment I am not proud of. I wrote a letter canceling it 5 months ago. I do not recall whether I mailed that letter or whether it sits still on my mantle. Either way, the cancellation did not reach you. For that, I owe you an apology. But the answer is the same. I am not taking a wife. I have not been a husband for 5 years, and I will not be one again. You came west for nothing, Miss Marsden. I am sorry." The world tilted. She had not eaten since the bread Prue had pressed into her hands at dawn. She had not slept the night before. She had ridden for 11 days and walked for an hour and been thrown into the mud, and now this man who stood like a granite pillar in front of her was telling her in a voice that was almost gentle that the only thread holding her up over the long, dark drop of her life had broken. She did not faint. She did not weep. Some Boston steel in her, put there by Eleanor Marsden, over 15 years of patient teaching, came up through her bones and held her on her feet. She lifted her chin. She looked Silas Thorne dead in the eye, and from somewhere very deep inside her, a place she had not known she still owned, 8 words came up. "I am not worth much, sir," she said, "but I can cook." Silas Thorne went very still. She kept her eyes on his. She did not blink. The snow was falling on her hair and her shoulders, and she did not feel it. "If you take me with you," she said, "I promise you will not starve. I will sleep in the barn. I will not ask you to be a husband. I will not ask you to be anything. I have nowhere else to go, and there is a man in this town who will be looking for me before sundown. I am not worth much, but I am worth a hot meal and a mended shirt, and I will earn my place on your mountain, or I will die trying. That is the bargain I am offering you." The amber eyes did not move from hers. For a long count of breaths, no one in that street made a sound. Even the wind seemed to hold itself. Then Jonas Thorne stepped up beside his brother. He did not look at Silas. He looked at Adelaide, and when he spoke, his voice had gone very low, the way a man speaks when he is past the point of arguing. "She comes with us, Silas," Jonas said. "I do not give a single damn what you wrote in that letter or what you did not write. There is a storm 3 days off, and a snake in this town with money in his pocket, and that woman is not staying in Iron Ridge to get eaten alive by either of them. She comes with us, to Spring. Then she decides." Zeke stood up. He was holding the broken cameo in his palm. He stepped forward, and he set it gently into Adelaide's muddy hand, and he closed her fingers around it, and he kept his hand on hers a moment longer than he needed to. "To Spring," Zeke said quietly. "That is all we are asking, brother. To Spring." Silas Thorne looked from one brother to the other. He looked at Adelaide. A great weariness passed across his face. The weariness of a man who had spent 5 years building a wall and had just felt the first stone slip out of it. He turned without a word. He walked to the pack mule tied behind his gelding. He untied the mule. He led it back to her. He did not look at her face when he spoke. "Get up on the mule, Miss Marsden," he said. "We have 3 days riding ahead of us. The pass closes in a week. Understand this before you climb up. This is not a marriage. This is shelter. You will have a roof and a fire until the spring thaw, and then you and I will speak again about what comes next. There will be no promises beyond that. Do you accept those terms?" "Yes," she whispered. "Then come on," he said. He cupped his hands. She put her muddy boot into them. He lifted her like she weighed nothing, and she settled astride the flour sacks on the mule's back and gripped the lead rope with white knuckles. Jonas swung up onto his bay, Zeke onto his roan, Silas back onto the black gelding called Cole. They rode out of Iron Ridge in single file with Adelaide Marsden in the middle and the snow falling thicker now, and Bart Kessler watching from the saloon window with a look on his face that was no longer amused. She did not look back at the town. She had nothing in it to look back for. The cameo was a cold weight in her closed fist. The wolfskin coat that Jonas had put on her shoulders was so heavy she could barely sit up under it, but it was warm, and she had not been warm in 3 days. Somewhere far ahead of her, 3 days up, a switchback trail, she could not yet see a cabin weighted with a kitchen she had not yet entered, and a rocking chair she had not yet been forbidden to touch. She knew only that she was on a mule and that her hands were cold, and that the man riding ahead of her had a back as straight as a ridgepole and had not turned to look at her once. The trail rose. The town fell away below them. The pines closed in. By dusk, they had climbed out of the valley and into the first of the high country, and the temperature had dropped 20 degrees, and Adelaide had stopped feeling her feet entirely. Jonas Thorne dropped back to ride alongside her mule. He did not say anything for a long time. He just rode beside her with one big hand resting easy on his thigh, watching her face the way a man watches a horse he is not sure has been broken yet. "You are doing fine, Ma," he said finally. "I cannot feel my toes," she said. "That is normal," he said. "You will get them back tonight by the fire. We will camp in another hour. You will eat. You will sleep. We will ride at first light." He paused. "I am sorry about my brother," he added. "He was not always like that. He used to laugh." "What changed him?" she asked before she could stop herself. Jonas was quiet a long moment. Then he said very softly, "Her name was Sarah." "And we do not say that name in his hearing. Not since the winter she went. You will see a chair in our front room when we get there, an oak rocker by the window. You will not sit in it. You will not dust it. You will not ask why. Do you understand me, Miss Marsden?" "I understand you," she whispered. "Good," he said. "Then we will get along just fine, you and me." He gave her a small, crooked smile, the scar pulling the corner of his mouth, and he urged his bay back up to ride beside Zeke at the head of the line. Adelaide looked at the back of Silas Thorne riding 50 paces ahead through the falling snow. He had not turned once, not in 3 hours of riding. The set of his shoulders was the set of a man carrying something very heavy and very old, and she understood for the first time that whatever waited for her at the top of this mountain, it was not going to be a marriage. It was not going to be a romance. It was not going to be a rescue. It was going to be a ghost. She tightened her grip on the lead rope. She fixed her eyes on his back. And somewhere down deep in the cold, tired bones of her, an old Boston steel set itself. If this man would not look at her, she would make him look at her. Not by begging, not by weeping, by being useful, by being unmissable, by cooking food so good he would forget to keep mourning while he was eating it, by keeping his hearth so warm and so clean that when he walked through the door at the end of a long, cold day, he would find for the first time in 5 years that the cabin smelled like a home and not a tomb. She would earn her place on that mountain, or she would die trying. The pines closed in. The light went blue. Somewhere ahead a wolf called out across a draw, and another wolf answered it from a ridge a mile away, and Silas Thorne rode on without turning, and the snow kept falling, and the winter of 1878 had its hand around all of them now, and would not let go for a long time. The first thing Adelaide Marsden learned about the high country was that it did not announce itself. The trail rose for an hour before she understood she was on a mountain at all. The pines simply grew taller. The air simply grew thinner. The world she had known, the brick streets and the gas lamps and the harbor smell of Boston faded out of her body 1 mile at a time, and by the time the four of them made camp that first night beside a frozen creek under a granite overhang, she was no longer the woman who had stepped down from the train at Iron Ridge. She was no longer entirely sure who she was at all. Jonas Thorne built the fire. He moved with the small, efficient hands of a man who had been making fire since he was 8 years old, snapping dry pine branches across his knee, shaving curls of birch bark with a knife that had no name and no decoration, but had clearly been sharpened 10,000 times. Zeke unsaddled the 4 animals and rubbed each one down with a handful of dry grass, talking to them low and easy, calling each one by name. The big black gelding was Cole. The bay was Hatchet. The roan was Penny. The mule that had carried Adelaide for 10 hours was, she now learned, a creature called Mr. Smith, and Mr. Smith had opinions. Silas did none of these things. Silas walked off into the trees with a rifle over one shoulder and came back 40 minutes later with 2 snowshoe hares hanging from his belt. He gutted them in silence at the edge of the firelight. He spitted them on green willow sticks and set them to roast. He did not look at her once. Jonas saw her watching, and he came and sat down beside her on the saddle blanket Zeke had spread out for her near the fire. He held out a tin cup of black coffee. She took it in both hands. The heat of it nearly made her weep. "He is not going to speak to you tonight, Ma," Jonas said quietly. "Maybe not tomorrow either. Do not take that personally. He has not spoken more than 10 words in a row to any living soul since the winter we lost Sarah. You are not getting the cold treatment. You are getting the only treatment he has left." She nodded into the coffee. She did not trust her voice. Zeke came over and crouched on his heels across from her. In the firelight she could see for the first time that the 3 brothers were not after all perfectly identical. Silas had a harder line at the jaw. Jonas had the long, pale scar down his left cheek. Zeke had the gentlest mouth and a small notch in his right eyebrow where something had once cut him, and his whiskey-colored eyes had a steadiness in them that the others did not quite have. "You will be cold tonight, Miss Marsden," Zeke said. "I am giving you my bedroll and my blanket. Do not argue. I have slept in colder places than this with less." She tried to argue anyway. He shook his head once kindly, and that was the end of it. They ate the hares in silence around the fire. The meat was tough and smoky and tasted of the woods themselves, and it was the best food she had put in her mouth in a year. When she was done, she set the bone aside and she licked the grease from her fingers without thinking, and Jonas laughed out loud, a short, surprised laugh, and Zeke smiled into his cup, and even Silas on the far side of the fire paused for one breath in the slow, careful work of cleaning his rifle. She caught herself. She blushed. She picked up the bone again and pretended she had not done it. "You are all right, Ma Am," Jonas said gently. "You are going to do all right up there." That night she slept on Zeke's bedroll under both his blankets, and she woke twice, once to the sound of a wolf calling on a ridge above them, and once to the sight of Silas Thorne sitting alone on a stone by the dying fire, his eyes fixed on the coals, his big scarred hands hanging loose between his knees, looking like a man who had not slept in 5 years and had stopped expecting to. The second day on the trail was harder than the first. The cold deepened. The trail narrowed to a thread. By mid-afternoon they were riding single file along a ledge with a granite wall on one side and a 1,000-foot drop on the other, and Mr. Smith picked his way along it with the bored patience of an animal who had walked this exact line 100 times. Adelaide kept her eyes on Silas's back and tried not to look down. She did not speak. None of them spoke. The only sound was the crunch of hooves in the new snow and the small dry rattle of the wind in the lodgepole pines. That second night they camped in a little hollow beside a half-frozen spring. Zeke cooked. He boiled cornmeal mush in a small iron pot and folded in strips of jerked venison and a pinch of salt, and he handed her a tin bowl of it without a word. It was plain food. It was the kind of food a man eats when he is too tired to care what is in front of him. But it was hot, and there was enough of it, and she ate every spoonful. Later, when the brothers thought she was asleep, she heard them argue in low voices on the other side of the fire. "You cannot just turn her out, come spring," Silas Jonas was saying. "You wrote that letter. You did this. That makes her your responsibility until she has somewhere else to go." "I never asked for a wife," Silas said. "But you wrote the letter," Brother Zeke said softly. 5 months ago. In a moment of weakness, you said. Maybe that was not weakness. Maybe that was the first honest thing you have done in 5 years. "That is enough," Silas said. "It is not enough," Jonas said. "It is not nearly enough. You have been a ghost in your own house since the day we put Sarah in the ground. We have buried our brother right alongside her. You understand me. We have lived with a stranger wearing his face. And now this little Boston woman walks up out of the mud, and you have looked at her the way you used to look at things just for a second twice today. And do not you dare tell me I imagined it. Do not you dare." There was a long silence. The fire popped. Silas said finally, and very quietly, "Do not push me on this, Jonas. Not now. Not her. Anyone but her." She closed her eyes against the saddle blanket. She did not understand all of what she had heard. She understood enough. She lay on her side with the cold creeping in around the edges of the blankets, and she pressed the broken cameo against her heart inside her bodice, and she made herself a promise. She would not ask any of them about Sarah. She would not push. She would not pry. She would simply work and watch and wait. She had survived Cornelius Pemberton. She could survive a ghost in a house. The third day, they came up out of the last switchback at mid-morning, and the trail leveled off, and the pines opened, and there it was. Bitter Creek. The cabin sat in a clearing on the south face of the ridge, with a view down the long blue throat of a valley that ran east toward Helena. It was bigger than she had pictured. A square, solid log structure with a stone chimney at one end, a deep covered porch along the front, 3 windows of real glass on the south wall, catching the late sun, and behind it a barn, a smokehouse, a chicken coop, and a paddock where 2 more horses raised their heads at the sight of the riders coming home. She had pictured a shack. She had not pictured this. This was a homestead. This was a place a man had built with the intention of staying. "Welcome to Bitter Creek, Mom," Jonas said quietly, riding up alongside her mule. "Be it ever so humble." "It is not humble at all," she whispered. He grinned. The scar pulled. "No," he said. "I suppose it is not." Silas was already off his horse and moving. He led Cole into the barn without a word to any of them. Zeke swung down and lifted Adelaide off Mr. Smith with hands so careful she felt for one strange, dizzy second like a piece of fine porcelain being moved across a table. Her legs were so stiff she nearly went down. Zeke held her up by the elbow until she could stand on her own. "You take her inside," Jonas said. "I will see to the animals." Zeke walked her up the porch steps. He pushed open the heavy plank door. The smell hit her first. Old smoke, old leather, old grease in a cast-iron pan that had not been scrubbed in a long while, pipe tobacco, wet wool, dust, the smell of 3 men who had lived alone on a mountain for 5 winters and had stopped caring whether anyone ever walked through the door behind them. It was a beautiful room underneath the smell. A great stone fireplace took up most of the north wall. A long pine table ran down the middle with 4 mismatched chairs around it. A cook stove stood against the east wall with a stack of split firewood beside it. There was a tall pine dresser, a pair of worn leather armchairs by the hearth, 3 doors leading to 3 small bedrooms along the back, a ladder up to a sleeping loft, and along one wall 2 shelves of books, real books, bound in leather, Tennyson, Wuthering Heights, Jane Eyre, a King James Bible, a worn medical textbook, 3 volumes of Shakespeare, a book on horse husbandry, a book in Latin she could not read the spine of. Zeke saw her looking. "Mine," he said quietly. "From my year at the college in Helena, before our father passed and I came home. You are welcome to any of them, Miss Marsden. They have been wanting a reader for a long time." Then her eyes went to the window on the south wall. There was a chair there. It was an oak rocking chair beautifully made with a curved back and small turned spindles. It had been polished once, but it had not been polished in a very long time. A film of pale gray dust lay across the seat, and the arms thick enough that she could see the print where a hand had once rested on it. The dust had been undisturbed for so long that she could not bring herself to look at it for more than a second. "Yes," Zeke said very softly behind her. "That is the chair Jonas warned you about. Please do not touch it." "I will not," she said. He nodded. He set her carpetbag down by the smaller of the 3 back doors. "This is your room," he said. "It used to be a storeroom. It has a small window and a small stove. Silas cleared it out 2 days before we rode down to Iron Ridge for supplies. Make of that what you will." 2 days before she said. Zeke gave her a quiet look. His mouth did not smile, but his eyes did, just a little. 2 days before Mom, he said. He turned and went back outside to help his brothers with the animals. She stood alone in the great room of the cabin she had ridden 3 days through the snow to reach. She set her muddy carpetbag on the floor. She put both her hands flat on the long pine table. She breathed in and out and in. Then she rolled up her sleeves. By the time the brothers came in for supper, the cook stove was hot. The floor had been swept. The table had been wiped down. 3 tin plates and 3 tin cups had been set out, and the whole cabin smelled for the first time in 5 years of biscuits. She had found a sack of stale flour in the pantry. She had found a side of salted venison in the smokehouse. She had found a tin of buttermilk powder, 3 dozen brown eggs in a basket on the dresser, a crock of bacon grease, and a small jar of dried sage. From these things in 2 hours she had made what her mother had taught her to make on the Sunday mornings when Henry Marsden had come home from the bakery, exhausted and quiet. biscuits and gravy, sausage from the venison ground in a little hand grinder she had found hanging from a hook, pan gravy with sage and pepper, fluffy biscuits golden on top and steaming inside 8 of them stacked on a tin plate in the middle of the table. Jonas Thorne came through the door first and stopped so suddenly that Zeke walked into the back of him. "Sweet baby Jesus," Jonas said. He took off his hat slowly. "Sweet baby Jesus in a buttered manger." Zeke leaned around his brother's shoulder. He looked at the table. He looked at Adelaide standing by the cook stove with a flour-streaked apron and her sleeves rolled to the elbow and a smudge of grease on her cheek. His mouth opened. Nothing came out. Silas Thorne came in last. He stopped in the doorway. He did not move for the count of 10 breaths. The dark gold gaze went from the biscuits to the gravy boat, to the swept hearth, to the wiped table, to the woman at the stove, and his face did something it had not done in 5 years. Not a smile. Not anything so soft as that. Just a kind of quiet collapse around the eyes, the way a man's face goes when he walks into a room and recognizes a piece of music his mother used to play. He took off his hat. He hung it on the peg by the door. He walked to the table without looking at her, and he sat down in the chair at the head, and he put his hands flat on the wood, and he stared at the biscuits. "Sit down, brothers," he said. His voice was rough. Just for that one sentence, it was rough. They sat. Adelaide brought the coffee pot to the table and poured for each of them, starting with Silas, because that was how her mother had always poured, oldest to youngest. She set the pot back on the stove. She stood by the wall, hands folded in front of her apron, the way a parlor maid stood because she had been a parlor maid for the last year of her life, and she did not yet know how to stop being one. Jonas looked up at her over a forkful of biscuit and gravy. "Ma'am," he said with his mouth full, "you sit down and eat with us, or I am going to be very put out." She sat. Silas had not yet picked up his fork. He cut one biscuit in half. He ladled a small spoonful of gravy onto it. He raised it to his mouth. He chewed once, twice. He set the fork down. He pressed the heel of his hand to his forehead just for a second, and his shoulders dropped and a long, slow breath came out of him that sounded like something he had been holding for a very long time. "You were not lying, Miss Marsden," he said quietly without looking up. "You can cook." It was not much. It was 8 words, but it was the first kind thing he had said to her, and she felt the heat of it run all the way down to the soles of her feet, and she looked down at her plate, and she did not let any of the 3 of them see what those 8 words had done to her face. That was the first night. The first week passed in a blur of work. She woke before dawn. She had the fire going and the coffee on and a pan of bacon hissing before any of the 3 of them came out of their rooms. She baked bread on the second day, 2 beautiful round loaves of sourdough from a starter she had made out of flour and creek water and the wild yeasts in the cabin air. She found that the floors had not been scrubbed in years, and she scrubbed them on her hands and knees with a brush and a bucket of lye water until the pine grain came up pale and clean. She mended 3 of Jonas's shirts. She turned the heels on a pair of Zeke's wool socks. She washed every plate and cup and pot in the kitchen and put them up on the dresser shelves in the order her mother had taught her, big to small, left to right. She did not touch the rocking chair. She walked around it. She dusted everything else in the room, every windowsill, every shelf, every mantel stone, and she went around the chair the way a body in a church goes around a coffin. She kept her eyes off it when she could. The dust on its arms stayed where it was. The brothers reacted to her each in his own way. Jonas warmed first. Jonas warmed fast. By the third day, he was teaching her things. How to read the difference between a deer track and an elk track in fresh snow. How to load a single-shot rifle. How to knot a hackamore. He brought her a sprig of winterberry, the small red berries he had broken off a bush down by the creek, and he set them in a tin cup of water on the kitchen windowsill without saying anything about it. The next morning, when she came in to start the fire, the cup was still there. The berries were the only color in the room. Zeke was slower. Zeke watched. By the end of the first week, he was sitting with her by the fire after supper, both of them with books open in their laps, reading in companionable silence. On the second Sunday, he came in from the barn, and he set a small leather-bound volume on the table beside her and said, "Tennyson. Some of his is grim, but the Idylls are fine. You will like the Idylls." She read aloud to him that night by the firelight, while Jonas worked at a snare he was repairing, and Silas sat in his chair at the table cleaning his rifle. She read The Lady of Shalott. She had a fine, soft alto voice, the voice that had sung in St. Augustine's choir on Sunday evenings, and the cabin went quiet for it. When she finished the last lines, the silence held for a long moment. Even Jonas had stopped working. Even Silas had stopped his slow, careful cleaning of the long Winchester barrel and was just sitting with the cleaning rod in his hand staring at the tabletop. Zeke said softly, "That was beautiful, Miss Marsden." Jonas cleared his throat. His eyes were unaccountably bright. "Beautiful," he agreed. Silas did not say anything. He resumed cleaning the rifle. But that night, after she had gone to her small room behind the kitchen and the cabin had grown quiet, she heard the creak of his bedroom door. She heard his slow, heavy step in the great room. She heard him stop, just for one moment beside the rocking chair. Then she heard him cross to the front door and go out onto the porch and stand there in the cold for a long time before he came back in. He never came near her room. He never spoke an unnecessary word to her. He was the one who, when she walked in with an armload of firewood, would silently take half of it from her without looking at her face. He was the one who, when she came back from the spring with 2 heavy pails, would already be bringing out the heated stones to set the buckets on so they would not freeze on the pantry floor. He was the one who oiled the door on her small bedroom when it began to creak without being asked while she was outside hanging laundry. She watched him without seeming to. She saw the way his jaw tightened when she sang to herself at the cook stove. She saw the way his eyes followed her hands when she rolled out biscuit dough. She saw the way he found small reasons to walk through the kitchen during the day, never speaking, never stopping, but always passing close enough to see what she was making, what she was wearing, where her honey blonde braid had fallen across her shoulder. "A man keeps his word," her mother had said once long ago in a Boston kitchen. A man keeps his word. Adelaide, watch his hands, not his mouth. She watched Silas Thorne's hands. They told her things his mouth would not. The cabin began to smell different. By the end of the second week, the old grease and old smoke had been pushed back, and in their place were the smells of coffee and yeast and pine soap, and on Sundays a small posy of dried lavender she had found in a tin in the pantry and set in a cup on the mantel. The dust came off the window sills. The brass lamp by the table was polished. The kitchen towels, 3 of them she had hemmed from an old flour sack, hung in a neat row on a peg by the stove. The cabin began to smell like a home, and Silas Thorne began to spend longer and longer periods of every day outside where the smell could not reach him. In the 3rd week, 2 things happened. The first happened on a Tuesday morning. She was kneading dough at the table. Jonas had gone to check his trap line. Zeke was out splitting kindling. Silas was at the long workbench near the fire oiling a saddle. They were alone in the cabin, the 2 of them, for the first time. The silence between them was a heavy thing, but it was not an angry thing, and she had grown used to working inside it. She turned to set the dough by the stove to rise. She slipped on a small slick of grease the cook stove had spit. She did not fall, but she went down on one knee hard, and a sharp little sound came out of her, more surprise than pain. Silas was across the room before she could stand up. She did not see him cross. He was just suddenly there, one big scarred hand under her elbow, the other at her waist, lifting her back to her feet so smoothly it was as if she weighed nothing. Their faces were 6 inches apart. His eyes were on hers. They were not empty. Not now. Not this close. They were the color of a candle flame seen through a glass of whiskey, and behind them was something so old and so tired and so frightened that for one breath she forgot how to breathe. She felt his hand at her waist. She felt the heat of him through 3 layers of cloth. "Steady, Miss Marsden," he said. The voice had gone very low. "The floor is treacherous when it is wet." He took his hand off her waist. He stepped back. He turned and walked out the front door without his coat. He stayed out for an hour. When he came back in, he did not look at her. That was the first thing. The second thing happened on the following Saturday. She was washing his old leather work coat in the wooden tub by the stove. She had let it soak in warm soap water to soften the dirt out of the seams. She put her hand into the inside breast pocket to be sure it was empty before she scrubbed it. Her fingers closed on something. It was a small, flat-shaped, soft cloth wrapped around something hard. She drew it out. Carefully, so very carefully, she unfolded the cloth on the table. Inside was a small silver locket on a fine chain, tarnished, plain, the kind a young husband might have ordered from a Sears catalog and saved up 6 months to buy. She did not open it. She did not need to. She knew whose locket it was. She knew the cloth wrapped around it was a woman's handkerchief embroidered with tiny blue forget-me-nots and 2 small initials in the corner, S and T, Sarah Thorne. She refolded the cloth around the locket with hands that were very careful. She put it back into the breast pocket of the coat. She did not wash that pocket. She washed the rest of the coat, dried it by the fire, pressed it with her palms to smooth the seams, and hung it on its peg by the door. She did not say a word to anyone. But that night when Jonas had gone out to the barn and Silas had gone to the smokehouse, she sat down across from Zeke at the kitchen table where he was reading by the lamp, and she said very quietly, "Zeke, tell me about Sarah." He looked up at her over his book. He looked at her for a long time. Then he closed the book. He set it on the table. He poured a fresh cup of coffee for both of them, and he told her. Sarah Whitcomb had been the only daughter of a doctor in Helena, educated, gentle, read German, played the spinet. She had come up to Bitter Creek the summer of 1869 with her father, who was checking on a miner's case of pneumonia 3 valleys over, and she had stopped at the Thorn place for a cup of water on her way home. Silas had been 24. He had walked out of the barn with a hammer in his hand and seen her standing on the porch, and that was that. They were married in the spring of 1870 in the little Methodist church in Helena. She had moved up to the cabin with 2 trunks, a feather bed, a spinet she could not bring with her and grieved for, and the oak rocking chair her grandfather had built for her in 1851. She had been the soul of that cabin for 3 winters. She had sung at the stove. She had read aloud by the fire. She had taught Zeke to make a poultice. She had taught Jonas to dance in the kitchen on Saturday nights badly and laughing. In December of 1873, she had gone into labor 7 weeks early. A blizzard had closed the pass. There was no doctor. There were 3 brothers. The labor went 30 hours. The baby came small and blue and did not breathe. Sarah bled and bled. She died in Silas's arms just before dawn on the 3rd day. The baby, a boy, had died an hour earlier. They buried them together, mother and son, under the great pine tree behind the cabin when the ground thawed in May. Silas had not laughed since. He had not slept in the bed they had shared. He had moved his things to the small room at the back. The big bedroom at the front was kept locked. The rocking chair was left where Sarah had last sat in it, with her sewing basket on the floor beside it, where she had set it down to go to bed the night her labor began. The sewing basket was still there, Zeke said. Adelaide had probably not noticed it. Most people did not. It was small, tucked behind the curve of the chair leg, half hidden by a fold of an old blanket. Adelaide was crying by the time Zeke finished, silently. She had not made a sound. The tears were just running down her face into her cup. "I should not have asked," she whispered. "You should have," Zeke said. "You needed to know. We needed you to know. We have lived inside this silence for 5 years, Miss Marsden. It is not good for the living to live inside the silences of the dead." He reached across the table. He laid his big, gentle hand over hers just for a moment, and then he took it back. That night, after the cabin was quiet, Adelaide got out of bed. She lit a small candle. She walked into the great room in her nightdress and her shawl. She crossed the room to the rocking chair. She did not sit in it. She did not touch the wood. She knelt on the cold floor in front of it, and she pressed her forehead very lightly against the curved oak armrest, where 3,000 nights ago a hand had last rested. "Sarah," she whispered, "I do not know if you can hear me. I do not believe in ghosts the way some do, but if any part of you is still here in this house you loved, I want you to know that I am not here to take your place. I am not here to be his wife. I am here because I had nowhere else to go, and because 3 good men your husband loves more than anything in the world rode down a mountain and would not leave me in the mud. I will not sit in your chair. I will not lie in your bed. I will keep your house warm for them this winter, and I will go in the spring if that is what he wishes. But I do not think your love for him would want him to die in this silence either. So, if I make him laugh once, if I make him eat, if I make him sleep through the night for the first time in 5 winters, forgive me. I think you would have done the same for me." She knelt there a long time, When she finally stood up, she lit the small lamp on the windowsill beside the chair. She turned the wick down very low. The flame was no bigger than a fingernail. It was a vigil light, the kind they had lit in St. Augustine's on All Souls' Eve. She left it burning. She turned to go back to her room. Silas Thorne was standing in the doorway of his small back bedroom in his shirt sleeves watching her. He had been there for some time. He had heard every word she had said. She froze. He did not move. For one long heartbeat, the great room was held in a silence so complete that she could hear the small pop of the wick on the windowsill. Then Silas Thorne lifted his right hand. He pressed it to his mouth. He turned very slowly and went back into his bedroom, and he closed the door behind him. She did not know what that meant. She would not know for another 4 weeks. She walked back to her own small room on bare feet. She got into bed. She lay on her back in the dark and listened to the wind starting to rise outside the cabin. She did not know that the cabin would soon be buried, or that a man she had begun to feel something for would be carried bleeding through that doorway, or that her hands would be the only thing standing between him and a grave under a great pine tree where 2 others already lay. She did not know any of it. She knew only the thing every woman in the high country had to learn fast or die learning. The mountain would test her. The mountain tested everyone. The only question was when and how hard and whether anything in her bones was strong enough to hold. For now, in the dark of her small room, she had only this: a house that did not yet love her but had stopped resisting her. 2 brothers who had become in 3 weeks more like brothers than any she had ever known. A 3rd brother who looked at her sometimes the way a starving man looks at a window full of bread, and a small flame burning on a windowsill beside a chair that had stood empty for 5 winters and was about to stand empty for the last time. The storm came down off the peaks on a Thursday afternoon in the 2nd week of December. It did not announce itself. The morning had been clear and still with that hard blue glass sky the high country gives you in winter when the air is cold enough to sting the inside of the nose. Adelaide had hung 4 shirts on the line behind the cabin. She had been thinking about a pot of bean soup for supper. By 2 in the afternoon, the sky to the north had gone the color of an old bruise, a deep purple gray with a strange green light behind it, and Jonas had come in from the smokehouse and looked once at that sky and said 3 words. "Take the line down." She had taken the line down. She had brought the 4 frozen stiff shirts inside and laid them across the backs of the chairs by the fire to thaw. By 3, the wind had risen hard. By 4, the first thick flakes were falling. By 5, it was a wall of white outside every window, and the cabin was creaking on its foundations like a ship in a heavy sea. And Silas Thorne was at the wood box counting how many split logs were inside the kitchen and how many were still stacked under the eaves of the woodshed 30 paces from the back door. "We need more in here," he said. He spoke without looking at any of them. "The wind shifted west 2 hours ago. This is going to run 3 days, maybe 4. We need every stick we can pull off that pile inside before the drifts close the path." "I will go with you," Jonas said. "You will not," Silas said. "1 man is enough. I am only carrying. If a tree comes down or a drift shifts, I do not need 2 of us under it." "I am going," Jonas said. He was already pulling on his heavy coat. "End of discussion, brother." Zeke met Adelaide's eyes across the room. He gave her a small, calm look and crossed to the door and unhooked a long coil of hemp rope from the peg there. He tossed one end of the rope to Silas. Silas tied it around his waist without comment. Jonas tied the middle. Zeke tied the other end to the iron hook beside the door frame, the hook that had been driven into the log 30 years before for exactly this purpose. "Stay with the fire," Miss Marsden, Silas said quietly. "Do not open this door for anything but our voices. Do you understand me?" "Yes," she said. He looked at her, just for one breath. His eyes were on her face, and they were not empty. "Good," he said. They went out. The door slammed shut behind them, and the wind hit it so hard it shook in its frame. She drew the heavy oak bar across it. She turned and pressed her back to it and closed her eyes. Zeke was beside her. She had not heard him cross the room. "They will be back in 20 minutes," he said. "They have done this 100 times. Come and sit by the fire. I will tell you about the winter of '72. He sat with her. He told her about the winter their father had been alive when a snowstorm had pinned the 4 of them inside this cabin for 9 straight days, and Jonas had taught himself the harmonica from a small instruction book their mother had once owned, and how by the end of those 9 days, even their father had been begging Jonas to please put the harmonica in the wood box where no one could find it. He made her laugh. She laughed for the first time since the storm had begun, and the laugh shook some of the tightness out of her chest. 20 minutes passed. The 2 men did not come back. 25 minutes. 30. Zeke stopped talking. He stood up from the fire. He went to the front window. He cupped his hands around his eyes and pressed them to the glass. The world outside was a screaming wall of white. He could see nothing. Adelaide stood up too. She was very calm. The calm came down on her like a second skin. She had felt this calm before the night her father died, the morning the bank seized the bakery, the hour she walked into Reverend Sutter's kitchen at 4 in the morning. It was the calm of a person who had been training her whole life without knowing it for moments like this. "I am going to set water on the stove," she said. "I will need clean linen. Where is your clean linen, Zeke?" His head came up. He looked at her. "Top shelf of the dresser," he said. "Folded white." "Why?" "Because they have been gone too long," she said. "Set the rope." He did not argue. He went to the door. He took up the slack of the hemp rope where it lay coiled inside the iron hook. He pulled. There was resistance, then sudden slack, the slack of a rope that had been tied around a man who was now lying down. He pulled hand over hand fast, and the rope came in fast, and then the rope went tight, and the door pushed inward against the bar, and a voice on the other side, half torn away by the wind, shouted, "Zeke! Zeke! Open the door!" "Jonas!" It was Jonas's voice. Zeke threw up the bar. The wind blew the door open with the force of a horse kick. Snow exploded into the room. Jonas fell across the threshold under the weight of his brother. Silas was draped across Jonas's shoulders, his face dead white. His right leg bent in a way no leg was meant to bend. Blood was soaking through the heavy denim of his trouser at the thigh. Black blood. Too much of it. Adelaide moved. She moved without thinking. She kicked the door shut behind them and threw the bar. She helped Jonas lower Silas to the long pine table. She seized the oilcloth off the table and bunched it under his torn leg. She tore the trouser open from cuff to hip with the shears from the kitchen drawer. The wound was a long, ragged tear on the outside of his thigh 3 inches deep, the muscle shredded by something jagged blood pulsing out of it in a slow, heavy rhythm. The widowmaker, Jonas, was saying, his voice shaking, "A pine, a dead pine. We were 10 feet from the woodshed. The wind took it down. I saw the top of it coming and I yelled, but he was bent over picking up an armload, and the branch caught him as it came down and threw him onto the rocks. I do not know how long he was out. I cut him loose with the hatchet. I carried him." "You did good," Adelaide said. Her voice did not shake. Her hands did not shake. "Get me boiling water. Get me whiskey. Get me the cleanest white linen in this house. Zeke, light every lamp in the cabin. I cannot work in shadow." She rolled up her sleeves to the elbow. She had nursed 3 sick children at her mother's elbow during the typhoid winter. She had watched a Boston midwife stitch a sailmaker's hand back together after a chisel slipped. She had read every page of the medical textbook on Zeke's bookshelf in the past 3 weeks by lamplight after the brothers were asleep because she had not been able to stop herself. The textbook had a chapter on penetrating wounds of the limbs. She remembered every paragraph. She did not pray. There was no time to pray. She worked. She washed the wound out with whiskey while Jonas held his brother's shoulders down on the table. Silas did not scream. He was past screaming. He arched once hard, and then he went limp, and his eyes rolled white, and he fainted, and that was a mercy. She washed it again with boiled water. She picked out 3 splinters of pine bark with the points of her sewing scissors. She threaded the finest needle in her sewing kit with a length of clean white silk thread that she had boiled for 2 minutes in the kettle. She set the first stitch, then the second, then the third. She did not count after that. She just sewed the way her mother had taught her to sew a torn hem, the way she had sewn the elbows of 3 of Jonas's shirts the second week of her life on this mountain. She closed the wound layer by layer, the way the textbook had said, deep first, then shallow, then the skin in fine, close stitches that would leave a scar but would hold. She packed it with a poultice of crushed willow bark and honey from the small crock in the pantry. She bound it with 3 layers of white linen. When she finally stepped back from the table, her arms were red to the elbow, and her hair was stuck to her forehead with sweat, and she had not breathed properly in 2 hours. Jonas was staring at her. He was crying. Not hard, just steadily, the tears running down his scarred cheek into his beard and dripping off his jaw. He had not let go of Silas's shoulders the entire time. "Miss Marsden," he said, and he could not finish the sentence. She put one hand on his shoulder. "Help me move him to his bed," she said quietly. "Then we wait." The fever set in by midnight. It came up hard and fast, the way fevers do in a man whose blood has run out of him. By the small hours of the morning he was burning. His face was the color of brick. He thrashed under the blankets and called out names in a hoarse voice that did not sound like his own. He called Sarah. He called for his father. He called twice for a brother named Eli that Adelaide had never heard of, which she would learn 3 months later was a 4th Thorn, a baby who had died at 6 weeks in the spring of 1850 and was buried under the same great pine where Sarah and her son lay. Adelaide did not leave him. She sat on the small wooden chair beside his bed, and she did not leave him for 3 days. She wiped his face with cool water. She fed him broth a spoon at a time, lifting his head with one hand under his neck. She made willow bark tea bitter as gall and got it down him drop by drop. She changed the dressing every 6 hours, day and night, and the wound stayed clean, and the angry red line that she had been afraid of, the line that meant the blood was poisoning, did not climb up his thigh. Jonas brought her food. She ate it without tasting it. Zeke brought her fresh water. She drank it without thanking him. They tried twice to make her sleep. She would not. She would close her eyes for 10 minutes at a time in the chair with her hand on Silas's wrist so that any change in his pulse would wake her. That was all. On the second night, the fever broke for an hour, and he opened his eyes. They were clouded. They did not see her clearly, but his cracked lips moved. "Adelaide," he whispered. She froze. Her name. Not Sarah. Not someone from his past. Her own name said softly into the dark by a man whose mind was wandering loose between the worlds. He had never spoken it aloud before. Not once in 3 weeks. He had called her Miss Marsden, woman, but never Adelaide, never the name her mother had whispered to her when she was a baby in a Boston cradle. "Do not," she heard him whisper. "Do not leave." "I am here," she said. "I am not going anywhere." He sighed once. His eyes closed. The fever rose again 20 minutes later. On the third night, Jonas came in and sat down on the floor beside her chair. He had not slept much either. His scarred face looked older than it had 3 days ago. "Rosalind would not have done this," he said quietly, looking at the floor. "Rosalind would have called for someone else to do it. She would have stood 3 feet back with a handkerchief over her mouth, and she would have looked at me with disgust the whole time." He paused. "I have not thought about Rosalind Vance in a year. Watching you these last 3 days, I will never think of her again. Whoever you marry one day, Adelaide Marsden will be the luckiest man this side of the Mississippi." He thought she was asleep. She was not asleep. She kept her eyes closed and let him think it. Some words a man needs to say into a dark room without being answered. She kept the words. She set them down carefully, somewhere inside her chest, where she could find them later. On the morning of the 4th day, Silas Thorne woke up. The sun was coming through the small window of his back bedroom. Adelaide had finally fallen asleep in the chair, her head against the wall, her hand still loosely closed around his wrist. He turned his head slowly on the pillow. He saw her there. He looked at her for a long time without moving. She woke because his pulse changed under her fingers. She opened her eyes. His eyes were on her. The dark gold of them clear at last, tired and sunken, and ringed with shadow, but clear. He was looking at her like a man looking at a face he had been afraid he would never see again. "Miss Marsden," he said. His voice was a rasp. "Mr. Thorne," she said. Her voice was a rasp, too. "You should be in your bed," he said. "So should you," she said. For one impossible second, the corner of his mouth moved, just the corner, just a fraction. It was not a smile, but it was a thing that wanted to be a smile 4 years and 10 months after the last one had died on his face, and she saw it, and her vision blurred, and she dropped her forehead onto the edge of the mattress, and she finally wept. He did not move his hand to comfort her. He could not. He was too weak. But he turned his wrist under her fingers slowly until his palm was pressed against hers, and he closed his big scarred hand around her smaller one, and he held it. He fell back asleep that way. She did not move. She wept quietly for 10 minutes, with her forehead on the mattress and her hand inside his, and then she fell asleep too, and Zeke found them like that an hour later when he came in to check the fever. He did not wake them. He pulled a blanket over Adelaide's shoulders, and he closed the door, and he went out to tell Jonas that their brother was going to live. The storm broke that afternoon. 4 days, just as Silas had said. Christmas came 2 weeks later, and it was the first Christmas in the Bitter Creek cabin in 5 years that anyone bothered to mark. Adelaide trimmed the great room with cuttings of pine and sprigs of red winterberry from the stand Jonas had shown her down by the creek. She made a fruit cake from dried apples and hoarded raisins and a precious half-cup of brandy from the bottle in the pantry. She made gingerbread. She made hot spiced cider with the last 6 apples from the root cellar. She made each of them a small gift. To Jonas, a long warm scarf in dark red wool knit from yarn she had unraveled from one of his own ruined sweaters. To Zeke, a fine bookmark of stiff linen embroidered with a tiny rose in red silk. To Silas, who was sitting up in a chair by the fire now, though he could not yet stand without help, a pair of heavy gray wool gloves, with a small pine tree embroidered on the back of each one. He turned them over in his big hands for a long time without speaking. Then he said very quietly, "Thank you, Miss Marsden." He had something for her, too. He pulled it out of his shirt pocket, a small thing wrapped in brown paper. She unwrapped it on her lap, and her breath stopped. It was a comb carved from a single piece of pine polished smooth as glass. Down one side of it, he had carved in tiny, careful relief a single rose half open. He must have been working on it for weeks. He must have started it before the storm. He must have started it before the day she found the locket. "I am not much for words," he said quietly. So she whispered. "Merry Christmas, Miss Marsden," he said. "Merry Christmas, Mr. Thorne." Across the room, Jonas pulled the harmonica out of his shirt pocket and began very softly to play Silent Night. Zeke joined him in a low baritone hum. After a moment, Adelaide began just as softly to sing. The alto voice that had sung in St. Augustine's came up out of her thinner than it had been in Boston, but still true, and the cabin held the sound of it, the way a cupped hand holds a candle, and Silas Thorne sat in his chair with the carved comb still resting on her lap, and his great scarred hand wrapped loose around a tin mug of cider, and his eyes did not move from her face. For the first time since 1873, the cabin smelled of pine cuttings and gingerbread on Christmas Eve. The peace did not last. In the 3rd week of January, on a cold, bright morning, when Silas was finally well enough to walk the porch on a cane Jonas had cut for him, Adelaide and Jonas went down to the spring together to fill the water buckets. The path was packed hard with 3 weeks of trampled snow. Jonas was carrying both yokes over one shoulder. Adelaide was walking ahead, her braid down her back. He stepped on a patch of glare ice. He went down with a startled bark of laughter. The 2 oak buckets clattered down the path, and one of them caught Adelaide behind the knees, and her feet went out from under her, and she landed in a snowbank with Jonas Thorne sprawled half on top of her, both of them gasping and laughing. She laughed until her eyes ran. He was laughing too, the scar pulling at his mouth. his face 6 inches from hers in the bright, cold January sun, and for one heartbeat the laughter stopped and his eyes were on her mouth, and her heart kicked once in her chest, and she saw him understand, and she saw him stop himself, and she saw the cost of it move across his face. He rolled off of her into the snow on his back. He stared up at the blue sky. His chest was heaving. "Forgive me, Miss Adelaide," he said. He had never used her first name before. "I forgot myself." "There is nothing to forgive," she said. "There is," he said quietly. "There is a great deal to forgive. Do not pretend with me. I do not have the strength for it today." He sat up. He gathered the buckets. He walked her back up the path to the cabin without speaking again. Silas was on the porch. He had been watching from the porch chair Zeke had set up for him in the morning sun. His cane was across his knees. The dark gold of his gaze was quiet and very steady, and it took in the picture of his brother and the woman walking up the path with snow in her hair and her cheeks flushed pink from laughter, and it did not show what he was thinking. He did not say anything that day. He said it at midnight in the barn, when he could not sleep, and he heard Jonas come out to check the horses. Adelaide woke to the sound. Their voices carried across the still, cold air. She sat up in her bed with her shawl pulled around her shoulders, and she went to her small window, and she opened it 1/2 an inch, and she listened. She did not want to. She had to. "What were you doing with her today?" Jonas Silas was saying. "Nothing happened, brother. I saw the way you looked at her." "I am a man, Silas. So are you. So is Zeke. Do not stand there in the dark and tell me you have not looked at her too. I have eyes. I see how you look at her every time she walks past you with a coffee pot. I see how Zeke watches her by the fire in the evenings when he thinks no one is looking. Do not pretend I am the only one who has noticed she is the most alive thing this cabin has held in 5 years. She is not yours to look at. She is not yours either, brother. You sent her away the day she arrived. You said the letter was a mistake. You do not get to be jealous of me now." A door banged. Adelaide jumped. Footsteps. "Stop! Both of you!" "Zeke!" Zeke had come out of the cabin behind them. "Stop!" Zeke said again. His voice was not loud. It was quiet and final and old beyond his years. "Listen to yourselves. You sound like 2 rival stags in a meadow. She is not a deer to be hunted. She is a woman with her own heart and her own choices, and you are both my brothers, and I am not going to stand here in this barn at midnight and watch a family that survived our father's death and Sarah's death and 10 Montana winters destroyed because 2 grown men cannot speak honestly about what is in front of them." There was a long silence. Brother Silas Zeke said, "If you love her, you tell her. If you do not, you let her go. Those are the only 2 doors. There is no third one." "Brother Jonas," he said, "if you love her, you tell her. If you do not, you stop touching her even by accident. Those are also the only 2 doors. And if she chooses neither of you, we let her go. With our blessing. With every dollar of furs we have stacked in that shed. With anything she needs to start again. Because we are thorns, and that is what honor demands." Silas and Jonas did not answer. Adelaide closed the window. She went back to her bed. She lay down on her side and pressed the broken cameo over her heart and stared at the dark wall, and she did not weep because she was past weeping. but she lay awake until dawn. 3 days later, on a Tuesday afternoon, Jonas rode down to Iron Ridge for supplies. The pass had been open for 2 weeks. He came back at dusk on the second day. His face was hard. He came through the door and shut it behind him, and he set his rifle carefully in the rack, and he turned to all of them. "Pemberton is an Iron Ridge," he said. Adelaide felt the floor move. "He has been there 4 days," Jonas said. "He has been buying drinks for Sheriff Crane. The sheriff is corrupt. We have known that for years. Pemberton has paid him in gold to deputize 4 men and ride up here. They are coming Friday morning. They have a paper. The paper says Adelaide is a fugitive from a debt in Boston. They mean to take her down off this mountain whether we like it or not." Adelaide stood up. "I will go," she said. Her voice was steady. "Tonight, I will go down on the back trail. He cannot have what he cannot find. I will not bring this on you. You have done more for me than anyone living owes another person. I will go." Silas stood up too. He had been sitting at the table mending a bridle. He set the bridle down. He limped 2 steps toward her. The cane tapped on the pine floor. "No," he said. No, Jonas said. Absolutely no, Zeke said. She looked at the 3 of them. She looked at Silas, with the dark gold burning in his gaze, and Jonas with the scar pulled tight across his cheek, and Zeke with the steady hand resting on the back of a chair. "Then sit down, Adelaide," Silas said quietly. "Sit down. We have until Friday morning. That is 3 nights and 2 days. I am going to tell you what we are going to do, and then you are going to tell us all of it, every part of it you have not yet said about that man, because I will not have my brothers and my home and my woman fight a battle in the dark when there is light to be had. Do you hear me, Miss Marsden?" His woman. He had said it without seeming to notice he had said it. She sat down at the long pine table. She folded her hands in front of her on the wood the way her mother had folded hers 30 years before in a Boston kitchen. She lifted her chin. She told them everything. About the loan, about the 17% interest, about the night Cornelius Pemberton had caught her wrist and smiled and told her she would change her mind by Christmas, about the rain she had run through to St. Augustine's, about the proposal in his hand that had not been a proposal. When she was done, the cabin was very still. Silas Thorne stood up. He walked slowly with the cane to the front window. He stood there with his back to all of them and looked out at the dark valley, and his great shoulders rose and fell once slowly, like a man taking the deepest breath of his life. He turned. "I am riding to Iron Ridge tomorrow at first light," he said. "Alone. I am bringing back 2 people. The first is a woman named Prudence Hawthorne who runs the boarding house in town. She watched this woman stand on her platform for 3 hours in the cold. She will testify to character. The second is a man named Reverend Obadiah Sutter, who came west in December after Adelaide's letter from Iron Ridge reached him, and his conscience would not let him sleep. He has been in Iron Ridge for 2 weeks waiting for word. He carries papers from Boston, 3 sworn affidavits from women Pemberton has assaulted, a copy of an internal audit of the Boston Mercantile Trust showing he embezzled $12,000 between 1872 and 1877. The man is a thief and an assailant and a fraud, and he has come to my mountain, and I am going to break him on it." He turned to Zeke. "Zeke, you will ride with me as far as the lower switchbacks. Then you will come back. I am not putting both of us on the trail at once. While we are gone, you and Jonas hold this cabin. You set the bear traps Jonas keeps in the smokehouse, the small ones with the rubber pads around the perimeter, at 100 paces. They will not kill a man, but they will scream loud enough to wake the dead. You bar every door and shutter every window after dark. You do not open this cabin to anyone but my voice, and my voice alone." He turned to Jonas. "Jonas, you ride to the telegraph office in Helena tomorrow at dawn before I leave. 3 days hard riding. You send a wire to the office of the United States Marshal. You give them the names and the charges. You ride back. You should be home by Thursday night. Friday morning I will be on this porch with the Reverend at my side and Mrs. Hawthorne in the front room, and you and Zeke at my flanks, and we will see what Cornelius Pemberton has come to my mountain for." Adelaide stood up. "Silas," she said. It was the first time she had used his given name aloud. He turned. The dark gold of his gaze met hers. "I have a thing to say to you," she said quietly, "before you ride. I will not say it in front of your brothers. So you will come outside with me on the porch for 1 minute, and then you will sleep and I will sleep and you will ride at first light." He came. She closed the door behind them. The cold hit her face. The stars over Bitter Creek were the kind of stars no Boston eye had ever seen, hard and white, and so many of them the sky looked dusted with salt. She turned to him under those stars. She put both her small hands flat against the front of his coat. She felt his heart beat under them, slow and heavy. "Come back," she said. "That is all I am going to ask of you in this life, Silas Thorne. Come back. Whatever else happens between us, whatever the spring looks like, whatever you choose, just come back off that trail alive." He looked down at her. He did not move. Then he lifted one big, scarred hand and laid it very lightly over both of hers, against his chest. "Adelaide Marsden," he said quietly, "I will come back. You have my word. A man keeps his word." He bent his head. For one breath, she thought he was going to kiss her. He did not. He pressed his forehead very gently against hers, just for the count of 3 heartbeats, and his eyes closed, and he breathed her in. Then he straightened. He took his hand off hers. He went back inside the cabin without another word. She stood on the porch a long time. She thought of an oak rocking chair that had stood empty for 5 winters and would not stand empty much longer. She thought of a small flame she had lit on a windowsill in the dark of the night 4 weeks ago. She thought of a man on a black gelding who would ride out in 6 hours alone into a country where his enemy had bought a sheriff and was waiting for him. She thought with a kind of bright, hard certainty that surprised her that she loved him. She had not said it. She would not say it yet. But she knew it the way a woman knows the sound of the wind that means weather is coming. She went back inside. She closed the door. She drew the bar. She crouched beside the rocking chair and put a fresh match to the wick of the small lamp she had lit 4 weeks ago and had tended every night since. The old flame had burned low, almost out. She fed it new oil from a brown bottle in the pantry. She raised the wick a little higher this time until the flame stood up clean and steady, the size of a thumbnail. "Sarah," she whispered to the dark room, "Sarah, watch over your husband on that mountain road tomorrow. He is riding for our sake. Bring him home." She would keep that flame burning until he was back inside this door. He left at dawn. The sky over Bitter Creek was the color of cold iron with a thin pink line in the east where the sun was thinking about coming up. Cole stamped in the cold air, his breath white. Jonas had already ridden out 2 hours earlier on Hatchet headed east for Helena and the telegraph wire. Zeke stood on the porch with his rifle cradled in his arms, dressed for the saddle. The two of them would ride together to the lower switchbacks, where Zeke would turn back and Silas would go on alone the rest of the way down. Adelaide stood in the doorway in her shawl. She did not come down the steps. She had said her piece on the porch the night before. She knew that any further word from her would only make the leaving harder for him, and Silas Thorne needed his leaving easy this morning, not hard. He needed to go down that mountain with a clear head and a steady hand on the reins. He swung up onto Cole. The leg was still stiff. He had to use the cane against the ground to lever himself into the saddle. But once he was up, and the cane went into the saddle scabbard alongside the rifle, and the man who looked down at her from that black horse in the gray dawn light was no longer the broken thing she had stitched up on a kitchen table 6 weeks ago. He was Silas Thorne again. He was a mountain man riding into a fight. He looked at her one long time. He did not speak. He did not need to. He touched the brim of his hat. He turned Cole. He and Zeke rode out of the clearing at a slow, steady walk, and the pines swallowed them, and Adelaide stood on the porch with her arms folded across her chest until she could no longer hear the hooves on the frozen ground. Then she went inside. She went to the rocking chair. She turned up the wick of the small lamp another 1/4 inch. 3 days, she said aloud to the empty room. Bring him home in 3 days. The cabin felt strange with only 2 of them in it. Zeke came back at dusk that first day, having seen Silas safely down to the lower switchbacks, where the trail met the wagon road into Iron Ridge. He brought wood. He stoked the fires. He sat across from her at the long pine table for supper, and they ate in silence, and he caught her watching the door more than once, and he reached across and laid his big gentle hand over hers and said, "He will come back, Adelaide. He always comes back. He has been riding that mountain since he was 8 years old." She nodded. She did not trust her voice. The second day she baked 4 loaves of bread she did not need. She mended a shirt of Zeke's that did not need mending. She walked the porch in her cloak 12 times, looking down the trail. The wind was small. The sky was clear. The cold was sharper than it had been in 2 weeks. The third day, just before noon, she heard hooves. She was at the cook stove stirring a pot of beef and onions. She froze. She listened. 2 horses, no 3. Coming up the trail at a slow, steady pace. Her heart was a fist in her throat. Zeke had heard them too. He came out of the back room with his rifle. He stood by the front window. He looked, and his shoulders dropped and a slow grin came over his face. "It is them," he said. "All 3. She ran. She did not mean to. She was halfway down the porch steps with her shawl flying out behind her before she knew her feet had decided to move. The 3 horses came out of the pines into the clearing. Cole in front and behind him, a stout chestnut with a small gray-haired woman bundled in furs riding side saddle, and behind her, a tall, placid old bay carrying a thin gray man in a black greatcoat with a Bible in a leather strap across his shoulder. Silas Thorne, Prudence Hawthorne, Reverend Obadiah Sutter, Silas swung off Cole, and his bad leg buckled under him on the landing. She caught him. She got under his arm and braced his weight against her shoulder, and she looked up into his face, and she saw the road dust on it and the dark hollows under his eyes, and she saw something else, a small, fierce light in him she had not seen before, the light of a man who had walked into an enemy town and come out of it with his witnesses. "You came back," she whispered. "I told you I would," he said. Prue Hawthorne climbed down off the chestnut with the easy grunt of a woman who had ridden horses since she was 4. She took one look at Adelaide and Silas, the way Adelaide was holding him up, the way he was leaning into her, and she did not say a word. She just gave a small, satisfied nod, picked up her carpet bag, and went up the porch steps, past them like a woman entering her own kitchen. Reverend Sutter dismounted more slowly. He was 67 years old. He had ridden 10 days on trains and 3 days on horses, and his old bones knew it. But when his feet were on the ground, he came to Adelaide, and he laid his thin hand on the side of her face like a father, and his pale, watery eyes filled with tears, and he said, "Child, oh my child, I have prayed every morning and every night since you got on that train." She put her free arm around his waist and pressed her forehead to his coat for one breath, and then she let him go because there was work to do. They came inside. Zeke set up beds. Prue took over the kitchen without asking, and within an hour, there was a great pot of coffee on the stove and a kettle of stew thickening, and a tray of fresh biscuits coming out of the oven, and Adelaide stood beside her at the cook stove, and they worked side by side without needing to speak the way women who have run kitchens their whole lives do. In the middle of the afternoon, Jonas rode in from Helena. His bay was lathered. He had ridden 3 days down and 3 days back and slept maybe 6 hours total. He came through the door and he looked at Prue and the Reverend, and he gave a tired grin and he said, "Well, looks like the cavalry beat me home. The wire is sent, brother. Marshal's office said 3 men would be on the road by morning. They will not be here by Friday, but they will be here by Saturday at the latest." Silas nodded. "Saturday is good enough. We only need to hold ground on Friday." That evening after supper, with the wind small and the stars hard in the windows, Reverend Sutter laid his leather portfolio open on the long pine table. He laid out the papers one by one in front of Silas and Jonas and Zeke and Prue and Adelaide. 3 sworn affidavits in 3 different women's handwriting, witnessed by 3 different Boston attorneys, describing in plain, spare language what Cornelius Pemberton had done to each of them between 1873 and 1877. A copy of an internal audit of the Boston Mercantile Trust, dated September of 1877, signed by a senior auditor named Jameson, showing $12,480 in irregular transfers traced to a shell company called Beacon Holdings Limited, which the audit identified as Pemberton's private property. Adelaide read each affidavit twice. Her hands shook on the second one. She had thought all these years that she had been the only one. She had been ashamed of being the only one. She was not the only one. She was the 4th, maybe the 5th. The other 3 had not run. "Pemberton does not know that audit exists," the Reverend said quietly. "The bank board has been waiting until they had enough to file federal charges. They have it now. By the time he rides up your mountain on Friday, he will have warrants out for his arrest in Massachusetts." He will not know. He will think he is here to collect a debt. He is here for revenge, Prue said. Not a debt. A debt is just the paper he carries it in. The truth of him is in those affidavits. Silas looked across the table at Adelaide. He said nothing. He did not need to. The dark gold of his gaze said everything. Friday morning came up cold and clear. By 8 o'clock, the cabin was ready. Prue was in the front room in a clean black dress, her hair pinned up tight, her small Derringer pistol tucked into her apron pocket, because she had carried that pistol for 30 years and had used it twice, and was not about to face Cornelius Pemberton without it. Reverend Sutter was at the long pine table with the leather portfolio open and the papers laid out under a hammered tin lamp. Zeke was in the loft above the front door with his rifle laid across the railing, a clear sight line to the clearing. Jonas was at the corner of the woodshed with his Winchester hidden behind a pile of split cordwood with a clear shot at the trail. Silas was on the porch. He was sitting in his porch chair with his cane across his knees and his Colt pistol holstered at his hip and the long Winchester leaning against the rail beside him within easy reach. He was not standing because he could not stand long without the cane, and he did not want Pemberton to see him on the cane. A man who was sitting could rise. A man on a cane was already half a cripple. Silas Thorne had not lived this long by giving advantages he did not have to give. Adelaide stood in the open doorway behind him. Her hands were folded in front of her apron. Her chin was up. She had braided her hair tight and pinned it under. She had washed her face. She had made her decision the night before that she would stand in that doorway in plain sight and not hide. She would not give Cornelius Pemberton the satisfaction of having scared her into a back room. They heard the hooves at 20 minutes past 8. 6 horses came up out of the pines into the clearing. Sheriff Hollister Crane in front, on a leggy gray, fat and red-faced with the silver star pinned crooked on his coat. Cornelius Pemberton beside him on a hired livery horse, bundled up against the cold in a fine wool coat that did not belong on this mountain, the leather portfolio under his arm, a thin black umbrella absurdly tucked into his saddle scabbard as if he were riding through Boston in March. Behind them, 4 men, the deputies' hard-looking range hands paid by the day their rifles slung across their backs. Sheriff Crane reined up at the foot of the porch steps. He looked at Silas. He looked at the rifle. He looked at the open door behind him with the woman in it. His small eyes narrowed. "Silas Thorne," he said. Sheriff Silas said, "You know why we are here. I know what you have come up here for," Silas said. "I am not yet certain you know why you have come." Sheriff Crane shifted in the saddle. "We have a warrant for the woman behind you. The woman is wanted for theft and breach of contract in the state of Massachusetts." "That warrant is paper," Silas said quietly. "Massachusetts state warrants do not carry weight in Montana territory without federal endorsement. You know that, Sheriff. So does the man beside you. So I am going to ask you to step down off that horse and come up onto this porch and have a cup of coffee with me, and we are going to discuss who actually has paper here this morning. Just us. Mr. Pemberton can wait in the saddle." Pemberton's face went the color of bone. Sheriff Crane hesitated. Then Pemberton spoke for the first time. His voice was the voice she remembered. Warm oil. Soft hands. "Mr. Thorne," he said, "you are harboring a fugitive. That is a federal offense. I have come a very long way to recover what is mine." Silas turned his head slowly to look at Pemberton. He did not speak for a long count. "What is yours?" he said finally. "The woman owes me $2,200, plus interest, plus the cost of my journey. Approximately $3,000 total. I am of course willing to accept her in lieu of payment given the impracticality of recovery. I am a reasonable man." Adelaide felt the porch boards shift under her. Silas had not moved, but Jonas, hidden behind the cordwood 30 paces away, had shifted his rifle. She saw it from the corner of her eye. The barrel had come up. Reverend Sutter stepped through the doorway behind her. He was a thin gray man in a black greatcoat with a Bible in one hand and the leather portfolio in the other. He walked past her, past Silas, down the porch steps into the snow of the clearing, until he stood 10 feet from Pemberton's livery horse and looked up into Pemberton's face. "Cornelius Pemberton," the Reverend said. His voice was thin and old, but it carried in the cold air like a bell. "Cornelius Pemberton. My name is Reverend Obadiah Sutter of St. Augustine's Episcopal Church, Hanover Street, Boston. I have buried you in my prayers for the last 6 years. I am here today to tell you that the Boston Mercantile Trust has, as of November 29th of last year, filed federal charges against you for embezzlement of $12,480 from depositor accounts. I am here to tell you that 3 women whose names you know have signed sworn affidavits describing in detail your personal conduct toward them between 1873 and 1877. I am here to tell you that warrants for your arrest have been issued in the state of Massachusetts and the Federal District of Massachusetts. I am here to tell you that the United States Marshal's Office in Helena has been notified of your present location and that federal officers are en route as we speak. I am here, sir, the Reverend said quietly, to bring you home. The clearing went silent. Pemberton's face had gone past bone. It had gone the color of something dead. His hand moved toward the inside of his coat. He should not have moved his hand. 2 things happened at the same moment. Behind Pemberton, the 4 deputies began to turn their horses because the 4 deputies were not federal men. They were men paid by the day, and not one of them was being paid enough to die for Cornelius Pemberton on a mountain in February. Sheriff Crane was already swinging his fat leg out of the saddle, hands raised, calling out, "Hold, hold, hold! I had no notice of any of this." And Pemberton's hand came out of his coat with a small nickel-plated pistol in it, and he raised it, and he was not aiming at Silas. He was aiming at Adelaide in the doorway. He did not fire. Prue Hawthorne fired first. The little derringer in her apron pocket came up through the cloth before she had even drawn it, and she fired through the wool, and the small bullet caught Cornelius Pemberton in the right shoulder just above the collarbone, and the nickel-plated pistol jumped out of his hand and into the snow, and Pemberton screamed a thin, high-pitched scream and toppled sideways off the livery horse into a drift. Jonas was already moving. He came out from behind the cordwood pile at a dead run with the Winchester at his shoulder, and Zeke was already coming down the loft ladder behind Adelaide, and Silas was on his feet on the porch with the Colt drawn leveled steady, and the 4 deputies had their hands above their heads before any of the Thorns had to say a word. Sheriff Crane was on his knees in the snow. He had his hands behind his head. His fat red face was the color of dough. He was saying over and over, "I had no notice. I had no notice. He told me she was a runaway servant. I had no notice." Reverend Sutter walked over to where Pemberton lay in the snow, whimpering and clutching his shoulder. He looked down at him for a long moment. Then he reached down and picked up the leather portfolio that had fallen from under Pemberton's coat, and he tucked it under his own arm, and he said very quietly, "You will not need that any longer, sir." Saturday morning, 3 United States Marshals rode up out of the pines into the clearing on 3 identical bay geldings. They were professional men. They wore long dark coats and bone-handled revolvers and the Federal star high on the lapel. They took Pemberton's statement, took Sheriff Crane's statement, took the affidavits and the bank audit from Reverend Sutter, took possession of the 4 deputies who had spent a polite night in the barn under Jonas's watchful eye, and rode back down the mountain at noon with all 6 prisoners tied in single file behind their horses. Pemberton would be tried in federal court in Boston in the autumn of 1879. He would receive a sentence of 17 years in the federal penitentiary at Charlestown. He would die there in 1885 of pneumonia alone in a cell, having received no visitors. Sheriff Hollister Crane would be removed from office in March, would never hold any position of public trust again, and would die in obscurity in Cheyenne in 1893. Adelaide would not learn any of this for a long time. By the time she learned it, she would barely remember Pemberton's face. The man would be a ghost to her, and not even an interesting one. The cabin felt different that Saturday afternoon. It felt like a place where a long-held breath had finally been let out. Reverend Sutter stayed until Monday. He walked the porch with Adelaide in the cold blue sun on Sunday morning, and he told her something she had not known, something the bank audit had revealed when the auditors traced Pemberton's shell companies. The Marsden Bakery and the brick house above it had been taken from her family illegitimately. The federal judge in Boston had already ruled that all of Pemberton's holdings under Beacon Holdings Limited would be liquidated and the proceeds returned to the families he had defrauded. Adelaide would receive by the autumn a settlement of $6,000. She would also receive the deed to a small property in the village of Salem, a stone cottage and 2 acres of garden land that had belonged to her grandmother on her mother's side and had been hidden from her in a separate trust. She did not know what to say. She walked with the Reverend to the end of the porch and back. She watched her own breath go up white in the cold air. $6,000. It was enough to buy a small bakery in Helena. It was enough to take a steamer to England and find her father's people. It was enough to do anything. She did not want to do anything. She wanted to stand on this porch. Sunday night, the 4 of them, the 3 brothers and Adelaide, sat around the fire after supper. Prue was in the kitchen with the Reverend washing the last of the dishes. The harmonica was in Jonas's hand, but he was not playing. He was just turning it over and over in his fingers, thinking. He stopped turning it. He looked across the hearth at Adelaide. "I have something to say," he said, "and I am going to say it once, and then I am not going to say it again, and you are going to take it for what it is." Jonas Zeke said gently, "No, brother. Let me." He turned to Adelaide. The scar was pulled tight on his cheek. The gray-blue eyes were steady. "Adelaide Marsden, I have come to care for you in a way I have not cared for anyone since Rosalind Vance broke my heart in Fort Benton in '73. What I feel for you is not built on a young man's foolishness this time. It is built on watching you stitch my brother's leg shut on a kitchen table while a blizzard tried to tear the roof off this house. I would marry you tomorrow if you asked me to. I want you to know that. But I have also watched my older brother these last 6 weeks. I have watched him come back from the dead because of you, and I will not be the man who steals back what God Himself seems to have given him. So I am telling you this only so you know, and then I am going to put it in a box, and I am going to be your brother for the rest of my life, and that will be enough for me. Do you hear me, Adelaide? I hear you, Jonas, she whispered. He nodded. Once, gave a small crooked grin, and put the harmonica to his lips and played one quick, happy little reel. And that was Jonas Thorne saying his piece and closing the door on it. Zeke got up from his chair. He came and sat on the hearthstone in front of her, his elbows on his knees, his whiskey-colored eyes on her face. I will be quicker than my brother, he said with a soft smile. I love you too, Miss Adelaide. I have loved you since the night you read The Lady of Shalott in this room. I think every man in this cabin loved you that night, but I knew it. But I also have a thing of my own. I have a place at the medical college in Denver come this autumn. I have been writing them letters since October. I want to be a doctor. I have wanted it since I was 16 years old, and I cannot ask any woman to wait 4 years for me in a wilderness while I do that. So, whatever you decide between you and Silas, you have my full blessing and my full friendship and my full prayers. And one day, when I come home from Denver, a doctor, I expect to find you here on this porch with my big brother, and I expect you to make me biscuits and gravy. Is that a deal? She was crying. She could not help it. She nodded and reached out and put her hand on the side of Zeke's face, and he laid his big, gentle hand over hers, and he kissed her forehead the way a brother kisses a sister, and he stood up and went to the kitchen to help Prue with the dishes. That left her by the fire with Silas Thorne. He had not spoken through any of it. He sat in the chair across from her with his bad leg stretched out and the cane against the chair and his big scarred hands folded loose in his lap, and he was looking into the fire, and the dark gold of his gaze caught the flame. He spoke without looking at her. I am older than I was 6 weeks ago, he said. Not in years, in the other way, the way that counts. He paused. I have a dead wife buried under a great pine tree behind this house. I have a son buried with her. I have lived 5 years inside a house where their absence was the only thing real. And then a Boston woman walked up out of the mud at Iron Ridge, and she said 8 words to me, and she would not look away from me, and she came up this mountain on a borrowed mule, and she has not looked away from me once in 3 months. He looked at her then. I cannot offer you what Jonas could, he said. I am not young. I will not laugh easy. There are mornings I will go out to that grave and stand a long time before I come back in, and there will be nothing you can do about that, and I will not want you to. I am damaged, Adelaide. I am marked. I will have a limp now for the rest of my life because a dead pine took a piece out of my leg, and I will have a scar on my heart for the rest of my life because the one woman I loved bled to death in my arms. That is what you would be marrying. She did not answer. She waited. But he said, And here his voice got very quiet. But if you can stand all of that, if you can take a man with one bad leg and one half-mended heart and 40 years left in him at most, if you can stand to be the second wife of a man who buries no one twice, then I will put a ring on your hand in front of God and the United States government, and I will spend whatever time the good Lord still gives me proving every single day that you were not, are not, never were worth nothing. You hear me, Adelaide Marsden? You were worth 1,100 miles. You were worth 3 days through a blizzard. You were worth the silence I have lived in. You are worth every breath I have left. She slid out of her chair and went down on her knees on the rag rug in front of his bad leg. She took both his big scarred hands in hers. She pressed them against her face. "I hear you, Silas Thorne," she whispered. "And the answer is yes. The answer was yes the day you put me on that mule. I just did not know yet I was already saying it." He did not pull her into his arms because he could not stand without the cane. But he leaned forward in the chair, and he pressed his forehead to hers, and he closed his eyes, and they sat that way with their hands locked together and their foreheads touching, while the fire cracked softly behind them, until Prue cleared her throat from the kitchen doorway and said, "Supper dishes are done, but if anybody wants pie, they had better come in here and get it before the Reverend eats the rest of it." And Silas laughed. He laughed. It was a rough, rusty sound, like a hinge that had not turned in 5 years. But it was a laugh. Across the room, Zeke and Jonas heard it, and they looked at each other, and Zeke put his hand on his brother's shoulder, and neither of them spoke. Adelaide stood up. She looked at the rocking chair by the window. She walked over to it. She did not sit in it yet. She put one hand on the curved oak armrest, and she stood there for a long, quiet moment, and the small lamp on the windowsill, the lamp she had kept burning for 54 nights, threw a warm, steady light onto the wood. "Sarah," she whispered, "watch over us." Then she turned back to the fire and to the man in the chair, and she did not look back at the chair again that night. The wedding was on the first Saturday of April, 1879, in a clearing under the great pine tree behind the cabin, when the snow had finally gone and the wildflowers along the creek were just beginning to come up. Reverend Obadiah Sutter had stayed in Iron Ridge through the winter on the strength of Adelaide's letters, and he rode back up to Bitter Creek at the end of March in a borrowed wagon, and he stood on Saturday morning in his black greatcoat with his Bible open, and he married Silas Thorne and Adelaide Marsden under the same tree, where Sarah Thorne and a baby boy named Eli lay sleeping, and there was nothing strange about it, and there was nothing wrong. Sarah's grave was wreathed with new wildflowers Adelaide had picked at dawn and laid on the stone with her own hands. Prue Hawthorne stood as Adelaide's witness in a respectable gray dress and a hat with one small pink rosebud pinned to it. Jonas stood as Silas's best man in a clean shirt and his red wool scarf around his neck. Zeke held the rings. Adelaide wore a simple cream-colored dress she had sewn herself over the long winter, and her honey-blonde hair was caught up under a wreath of wild prairie crocus, and the cameo brooch repaired was at her throat. Silas wore his late father's only black suit, brushed clean with his cane across his arm. The leg had healed, but it would always be stiff. He no longer minded. When Reverend Sutter came to the part that said, "Do you, Silas Thorne, take this woman?" Silas said, "I do," with the rough certainty of a man saying the truest thing he had ever said. When the Reverend asked, "Do you, Adelaide Marsden, take this man?" Adelaide said, "I do," and added very softly, "forever and always." Silas bent his head. He kissed her once gently under the great pine. Jonas put the harmonica to his lips and played a quick, happy little wedding reel that Adelaide did not know. But Prue and Reverend Sutter both did, and they all walked back to the cabin together along a path that smelled of new earth and growing pine, and Prue had laid the long pine table inside with white linen and a venison roast, and 4 loaves of fresh sourdough and a real iced cake Adelaide had baked the night before. And the 4 of them and Prue and the Reverend ate together until the sun went down, and Jonas told stories and made his older brother laugh 4 separate times, and Adelaide kept count. That night, Silas led her not to the small back bedroom where he had slept for 5 years, but to the front bedroom, the big one that had been kept locked since 1873. He had unlocked it that morning. He had aired it. He had laid clean sheets on the bed Sarah had once slept in. He had done it himself. He had not asked anyone for help, and no one had asked him whether he wanted any. He stood in the doorway with the door open and a single beeswax candle burning on the chest of drawers, and he held out his hand to her, and Adelaide stepped through that doorway and into the rest of her life, and the door closed behind her, and outside, in the high country dark, an owl called once across a draw, and the great pine tree stood over its 3 sleepers in the small graveyard, and the world turned. When the morning came, Adelaide Thorne walked into the great room of the cabin that was now her cabin, and she made coffee, and she set the table for 4, and she sat down for the first time in the oak rocking chair by the south window, and she rocked once very slowly, and the chair held her, and the small lamp on the windowsill, which she had kept burning every night for 137 nights, was finally gently blown out by Silas Thorne, who came up behind her and laid his big scarred hand on her shoulder and said, "You can let it go now, Adelaide. She is at peace. So am I." The summer of 1879 came soft over Bitter Creek. The wildflowers spread across the south meadow in a sea of blue and yellow. Adelaide planted a kitchen garden behind the cabin, the first vegetable garden the place had seen in 5 years. Silas built her a chicken coop with his own hands, slowly working through his stiff leg, finishing it on a Sunday afternoon in late June. By July, she had 8 laying hens and was selling fresh eggs to Prue in Iron Ridge twice a month. Zeke left for Denver in August, with a leather satchel over his shoulder and $1,200 of Adelaide settlement money in a banker's draft sewn into the lining of his coat. He had refused at first. She had insisted. She had told him very plainly on the porch the morning of his departure that her mother had taught her once that money was only money, but a doctor in the family was a fortune. She had pressed the draft into his hand and closed his fingers around it, and told him to go become the kind of man Sarah would have wanted to nurse beside her. He had cried then, only the second time she had ever seen Zeke cry, and he had ridden out at noon, headed east for the railhead at Helena, and she had stood on the porch with Silas's arm around her shoulders and watched him go. The autumn brought the last of the federal proceedings against Cornelius Pemberton. Adelaide gave her testimony by sworn deposition through a lawyer in Helena. She did not have to travel back to Boston. The judge ruled in her favor on every count. The deed to the Salem cottage came to her in October. She wrote to her mother's older sister and Aunt Cordelia she had never met, and offered her the cottage as a residence for the rest of her life. Aunt Cordelia accepted with a tearful letter and a small enclosed daguerreotype of Eleanor Marsden as a young woman of 19. Adelaide hung it on the wall above the cook stove. Silas would catch her standing in front of it, sometimes holding her wooden spoon, just looking, and he never said a word, or said a... Their first child was born in February of 1880, in the front bedroom of the Bitter Creek cabin, in the bed where Sarah Whitcomb had once died, and where Sarah Thorne was now laid to rest in spirit. The pass was open this time. Dr. Macy had ridden up from Iron Ridge 2 days earlier and had been waiting in the front room playing whist with Prue Hawthorne, who had refused to be anywhere else. The labor was long but unremarkable. The baby was a fat, red-faced boy with a pair of remarkable dark gold eyes and a healthy set of lungs. They named him Asa Thorne after a great-uncle on Henry Marsden's side who had been a sea captain out of Liverpool. When Silas held his son for the first time, sitting on the edge of the bed in the morning light with the small bundle in the crook of his arm, he did not say a word for a long time. He just looked. Adelaide watched him from the pillows. She watched something old and dark and frozen finish breaking up inside him, the way the river breaks up in April all at once, with a sound like a cannon. He bent his head over the baby. He pressed his lips to the small forehead. "Welcome home, Asa Thorne," he whispered. Their second child came in May of 1882, a little girl, dark-haired, blue-eyed. They named her Mercy after no one in particular because by then they had outgrown the names of the dead and were ready to make new ones. Jonas Thorne married Beth Hawthorne Prue's niece, who had come west from Chicago that summer of 1881 to help her aunt run the boarding house in the autumn of 1882. Beth was a tall, sharp-boned, dark-haired woman of 27 with a quick laugh and a quicker temper, and she did not put up with 1 ounce of Jonas Thorne's nonsense, and Jonas Thorne adored her for it. They built a second cabin a 1/4 mile down the ridge from the main house, and they had 4 children in 7 years, 2 boys and 2 girls, all of them dark-haired like their mother and scar-faced like their father. Zeke Thorne completed his medical studies in Denver in the spring of 1883. He came home that summer with a young woman named Lavinia May Holloway on his arm. Lavinia May was the only daughter of the chief physician at the Denver General Hospital, a small, bright, cheerful woman who had read every book Zeke had ever owned, and several he had not. They were married in the cabin at Bitter Creek in September with Jonas's harmonica and Silas leaning on his cane and Adelaide standing as matron of honor. Zeke and Lavinia settled in Denver, where Zeke became known over the next 30 years as one of the finest internal physicians in the Mountain West. They had 3 children. They came back to Bitter Creek every summer with the children for a month, and Adelaide always laid the long pine table for 10 on the night they arrived. In the spring of 1888, with money Adelaide had set aside steadily over 9 years, she opened a small bakery on the main street of Iron Ridge, in a storefront she rented from Prue Hawthorne for $1 a year. She called it the Marsden Thorne Bakery. She drove down with Asa, then ate in a buckboard 3 days a week, and baked in the morning and sold all afternoon, and drove back up the mountain at dusk. The bakery did not make her rich. It made her instead something rarer. It made her a woman the town of Iron Ridge knew by name, the same town that had thrown her into the mud in November of 1878. Came over time to bring her flowers when her babies were born, and casseroles when one of them had a fever, and finally, when she was an old woman, a small brass plaque set into the wall outside her bakery that read, "Mrs. Adelaide Thorne. Came west on a borrowed mule. Stayed." Bart Kessler was no longer at the Golden Nugget. Bart Kessler had been killed in a knife fight over a card game in the spring of 1880, a thing Adelaide learned from Prue in passing one afternoon over coffee. She nodded at the news. She did not feel anything at all. The mud he had thrown her into had become, in the end, the only ground she ever wanted to stand on. The years went by. The seasons turned over Bitter Creek, the way seasons do in the high country, slow and immense and indifferent. The pines grew taller. The cabin grew larger, with a wing added in 1885 for the children, and a second porch added in 1891 for Prue, who came up from Iron Ridge every summer for 2 months when she got too old to manage the boarding house alone. Asa Thorne grew up tall and quiet like his father, with his father's dark gold eyes and his mother's gentle hands. And at 20, he married a Helena school teacher named Hannah and came back to manage the Bitter Creek Ranch. Mercy Thorne grew up dark and bright and read every one of her Uncle Zeke's books before she was 16, and at 22, she married a young lawyer named Thomas Calloway and settled in Iron Ridge as the schoolmistress, a position she would hold for 37 years. Reverend Obadiah Sutter died in his sleep in Iron Ridge in the winter of 1886 at the age of 75 and was buried in the small cemetery at the foot of the ridge. Adelaide and Silas rode down for the funeral. She laid a small bouquet of dried lavender on his grave. Beneath the lavender she laid the cameo brooch, the one that had broken the day she fell in the mud, that she had carried in her pocket every day for 8 years. She did not need to carry it any more. She had become the thing it had been protecting. Prue Hawthorne lived to be 91, and she died in the front bedroom of the Bitter Creek cabin in the spring of 1907, with Adelaide holding her hand and Silas in a chair by the window. Her last words were, "You done good, child," and Adelaide had laid her gray head down on the old woman's hand and wept the way you weep for a mother twice given. Then came the autumn of 1908. It was 30 years to the month since a young woman in a navy blue traveling dress had stepped down off a train at the foot of Iron Ridge with a carpet bag in her hand and a folded letter against her heart. Adelaide Thorne was 53 years old. There was silver at her temples now mixed in with the honey blonde, and a small fan of fine lines at the corner of each eye. She had grown softer in the body the way women do who have borne 2 children and fed 3 brothers and a town for 30 years. But her back was still straight, and her hands were still capable. And the cameo brooch, dug up out of an old churchman's grave, by her own hand, the spring after Reverend Sutter died, was once again at her throat. Silas Thorne was 63. His hair had gone white in his 50s the way amber-colored hair will all at once in one bad winter. He still walked with the cane. The leg had given him pain every cold morning for 30 years, and he no longer cursed it. He sat now in a heavy oak chair on the wide front porch. His son had built him with a wool blanket across his knees and a tin cup of coffee on the small table at his elbow, and he watched in the slanted gold light of an October afternoon 4 small figures running through the wildflowers at the edge of the south meadow. 2 of them were Asa and Hannah's children, a boy of 7 called Henry after Adelaide's father, and a girl of 5 called Eleanor after Adelaide's mother. The other 2 were Mercy and Thomas's twin boys, 4 years old, named Jonas and Zeke, after their great-uncles, and they could not yet pronounce either name correctly, and so they called themselves Joe and Eek. Beth and Jonas Thorne's eldest, a long-legged young woman of 24, named Sarah Beth, was teaching the 4 little ones how to play hide-and-seek among the lupines. Down at the second cabin, Beth Thorne was setting out a long pine table on the lawn for a supper that would, before the sun went down, seat 17 Thornes and Marsdens and Hawthorns and Callaways together. Jonas Thorne, 63 years old now, and the scar on his cheek long since faded into the weathered map of his face, sat on the edge of his porch a quarter-mile down the ridge with the harmonica in his hand. He was not playing yet. He was watching the children and waiting for the rest of the supper to come up. Beth, 26 years, his wife, and still able to bend him to her will, with a single look, came out of the cabin behind him with a covered dish and a sharp word about him doing no work, and Jonas grinned the same crooked grin he had given Adelaide on a muddy street 30 years before, and stood up to help her. Zeke Thorne was inside the main cabin with Lavinia May. They had ridden the train up from Denver that afternoon for the family supper. Zeke was 63, a lean iron-gray man in a fine wool suit, the most respected internist west of the Mississippi, the author of 2 medical textbooks, and he was at this moment in the kitchen of his brother's cabin with his sleeves rolled up to the elbow, helping his sister-in-law slice apples for a deep dish pie. Lavinia May stood beside him, kneading bread dough in an apron borrowed from Adelaide, talking softly with Mercy about a book Mercy had just read. Adelaide came out onto the porch with 2 fresh tin cups of coffee. She handed one to her husband. She sat down beside him in the second oak chair Asa had built for her, the chair that, since the year she turned 40, she had begun to think of privately with something close to amusement as her mother's chair, although her mother had been dead now for 34 years. The thought no longer hurt her. Most things in the end had stopped hurting her. The 2 of them sat in the slanted October sun and watched the children running through the meadow. Silas reached across the small space between the chairs without taking his eyes off the meadow. He laid his big scarred hand, weathered now, knotted at the knuckles, freckled with age, over hers on the chair arm. His hand had not lost its weight. His hand had not lost its meaning. "Adelaide," he said quietly. "Yes, my love. Do you remember the first words you ever spoke to me, that day in Iron Ridge?" She looked at him. She smiled the slow, soft smile of a woman who had learned over 30 years that the answer to almost any question her husband asked her was already known to him before he asked it. "I said I was not worth much," she said, "but that I could cook." Silas nodded slowly. He turned his head and looked at her. The dark gold eyes were the same eyes that had looked down at her from a black gelding in a muddy street in 1878. They were old now. They were tired, with the kind of tiredness that comes only at the end of a life lived all the way through. But they were still bright. "You were wrong," he said. "I know," she said. "You were wrong about every word of it. I know that too. You were worth 1,100 miles. You were worth 3 days through a blizzard. You were worth every cup of coffee on this porch, every loaf of bread you ever baked, every minute of sleep I have had for 30 years, every breath I have taken since you climbed up onto that mule." She turned her hand over under his and laced her fingers through his fingers. The cameo brooch caught the late sun. "And you, Silas Thorne," she said quietly, "were worth my journey from Boston. You were worth my fall in the mud. You were worth every cold tear, every cold fear, every cold night between South Station and this porch. You and Jonas and Zeke, the 3 of you, have been my home. You are my home. You always will be." He bent his head and pressed his lips to the back of her hand the way he had been doing every evening on this porch for 29 of their 30 years, and they sat that way, with their hands locked together and the wedding rings catching the last of the light while down in the meadow. Henry Thorne shouted something to his sister Eleanor, and the 2 of them ran laughing toward the supper table where their grandmother had taught them to come when the bell was rung, and somewhere down the ridge the bell was just then beginning to ring, and Jonas Thorne lifted the harmonica to his lips and began very softly to play Silent Night, even though it was not Christmas, because it had become his way of calling his family in, and from inside the cabin Lavinia May and Mercy were singing with him, and the silver in Adelaide's hair caught the gold of the autumn sun. Tonight, my friends, that is the story I promised you, the story of a woman who once knelt in the mud of a Montana street and believed with all her heart that she was worth nothing. The story of 3 brothers on a mountain who heard her say 8 words and never let her be alone in the world again. The story of a chair that stood empty for 5 winters, and of a small lamp that burned for 137 nights, and of a great pine tree under which 3 thorns lay sleeping, while above it 5 generations of new thorns grew up and grew old, and made coffee, and made bread, and made babies, and made peace with what had come before. The cabin still stands today on a quiet ridge above what is now a paved road that runs east toward Helena. The great pine is still there. The graves under it have been added to since 1908. Adelaide Thorne would lie down beside her husband in the spring of 1923 at the age of 67, having outlived him by 4 years. Their headstones are simple dark gray granite side by side, and the inscription on hers reads simply, Adelaide Marsden Thorne, 1855 to 1923. Beloved wife, Mother Baker. She came up the mountain on a borrowed mule, and she stayed. Sometimes, my friends, salvation comes wrapped in a wool coat that smells of pine and wood smoke. Sometimes a man's hand under your elbow on a muddy street is the first prayer of a life you did not know you were about to receive. Sometimes the woman who tells you she is not worth much is the woman who will give in 30 years and the chance prove herself worth everything and more than everything and more again. If you have stayed with me to the end of this story, I thank you. Hit that subscribe button if you have not already. Drop a comment and tell me where you are listening from tonight. Tell me what you thought of Silas and Adelaide. Tell me about the woman in your own life who once told you she was not worth much, and how you set about the way Silas Thorne did, proving her wrong every single day until she no longer believed it. Keep your fires lit. Keep your powder dry. Keep your hearts open to the unexpected woman in the muddy street. I am Marcus, and this has been Frontier Rescue Stories. Until next time, my friends, good night.